What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and God, the ending of this is probably going to be one of the most important things that I think Marvel has been doing recently in Marvel Comics. So much so that, we literally just kind of have to cover this as a one-shot origin. So this takes place in Immortal X-Men, and it basically builds and expands on the origin of Mister Sinister from Marvel Comics, going into the Sins of Sinister storyline, which will basically make the whole thing make more sense. So what this does here is this initially opens up with Mystique, basically making her way into a military base in New Mexico in 1943. Now, one of the things to understand here, and this is what's really cool, is that as she makes her way through, of course, using her powers and so on and so forth, subduing the different soldiers and so on, she ends up coming across Irene Adler. Now, one of the things to know is that Irene Adler, of course, the mutant Destiny, she's a precog. For those of you guys who are not familiar with Irene Adler, if you know who she is, bear with me here for a second. Destiny is a precognitive where she can basically see the future. The further away she looks, or the further into the future she looks, the less certain things are. The closer she looks into the future, the more certain things are. But the thing that's going on here, and the reason why Irene Adler's even here in the first place and Mystique is meeting up with her, is because this is a laboratory, or basically a facility, where Mister Sinister is working. Now, one of the things that I want to specify here is that Sinister is a character with an exceedingly long history in Marvel. And we'll talk about the existing origin for his character as we get further into this, specifically the story from 1996, The Adventures of Cyclops and Jean. But the reason why this matters in terms of it being in 1943 is because this is where Sinister was operating at the time. That one of the things that Sinister had done over the course of his existence is he had become obsessed with the idea that individuals were popping up around the world that had powers, right? Basically mutants. And so one of the things that he had done during World War II is he had experimented on people in German camps. The reason why that matters is because following the end of the war and the liberation of all those camps, a guy named Truett Hudson had discovered the journals of Sinister, and that's what led to Weapons Plus, right? That's what led to Wolverine and Phantom X and the Stepford Cuckoos and all those guys, right? So a little cool bit of history there when it comes to how the Weapons Plus and Weapons 2 through 10 programs came into existence. Weapon 1 is Captain America. That actually was not based on the works of Sinister, at least not that I'm aware of, because I feel like the discovery of Truett Hudson happened after Captain America was frozen in ice. So Marvel doesn't really reconcile that too well. But the thing that Irene Adler says, and while her and Mystique have a very lengthy history together, Irene Adler says she's here and she's quote-unquote assisting Sinister in experimenting on mutants because the end result, right, the ends justify the means. Yes, there's some pretty shady stuff going on here right now, but at the end of the day, what can be learned from this and the greater consequence of what Sinister's doing is more important than the lives of the people who are being sacrificed here at the moment. And that's one of those moral things that really plays into the nature of Destiny. Oftentimes, she'll let people be sacrificed in the moment if it goes towards something more important. Now, a person who can't see the future, of course, cannot necessarily see the bigger picture. And the average person operates in the here and now, not being able to see or even understand what role they play in the greater landscape. So to that person being experimented on, it's begging the question, why isn't anybody helping me? Whereas Destiny looks at that and says, because quite literally your life in the moment is basically meaningless. And your sacrifice here will go to a much bigger thing. But from here, there's really kind of a discussion between the two of them in terms of asking the question, how did Sinister survive his first death in the first place? And so what we do is we jump back to 1895 in London, England. And this is when we really start to get into the nature of Sinister's origin. What we actually end up having here in a really, really cool moment is we pick up at 221 Baker Street or 221B Baker Street. Anybody who knows anything about that address knows that's the address of Sherlock Holmes. Now, one of the funny things about this, and I love that Marvel's doing this, Sherlock Holmes does exist in Marvel Comics. He was in the old Marvel Preview issue number 5 back in 1976. He was there for one story. Nobody really cared. Ultimately, Marvel just kind of axed the existence of the character. I love that they're doing that by basically saying it was Mystique operating as basically Sherlock Holmes, pretending to be him. Whether or not it was there is an actual Sherlock Holmes and Mystique was impersonating him, or Marvel simply just saying there never was a Sherlock Holmes and it's just an identity that Mystique is taking, is really just kind of, up to interpretation, to be quite honest, because even now they don't necessarily clarify it too well. But what's cool is that the two of them basically end up meeting up in order to travel to Millbury House, which is where Sinister is operating out of at the moment. And in fact, when they get there, they don't really meet Sinister, they meet Nathaniel Essex. Now, here's the cool thing about this, and this is when we really start to get into this origin, because what ends up happening here is Mystique and Destiny have this conversation with Essex where he says, my work on the Essex factors would be much more advanced if I could be returned to the years I wasted on like love. Nathaniel Essex's wife died at some point, and so he really like looks back on his life and says, instead of getting involved in things like love, I could have been working on my research, right? Like love prevented me from becoming successful and focusing on more important things as far as he's concerned. Don't know I entirely agree, but nonetheless, right? What's really cool here is that Irene Adler chimes in and says, Lord Darwin, right? This is the time when Charles Darwin was still like the top guy in the scientific community. She says that according to Darwin, the works of Sinister were basically a monstrous misunderstanding of Darwin's work himself. And she fears that basically she has to agree here. That she asks, have you ever read Nietzsche? Your talk of superior beings echoes him. His work also ended in madness. It is not too late to turn back. Now, here's the reason why this discussion matters here. And this is how we basically start to get into the origin of Sinister. In the early days of Nathaniel Essex, when he was in the scientific community and he was obsessed with the idea that basically mutants were popping up, what he's referring to as the Essex factor is the X gene inside of mutants that has not been activated yet, right? Remember, the X gene in mutants activates either through puberty or moments of high duress or something like that. But in having no real name called the X factor, he simply refers to it as the Essex factor. He names it after himself, is really all it is. But there came a point when he created this really kind of Frankensteinian depiction of what those individuals out there who are basically mutants that have powers would look like. He built his work on the work of Charles Darwin and saying that Charles Darwin argues that evolution reigns supreme, that individual organisms, right, birds and bugs and animals and so on and so forth, that they all exist in these different environments and ecosystems. And over time, those environments and ecosystems will change, and that evolution will take hold of those animals and they will evolve to basically adapt in that environment. What got him cast out of the scientific community was his depiction of the Essex gene and his depiction of what a future mutant might look like, which was honestly very grotesque to the scientific community at the time. They considered him to be a madman, and they ultimately forced him out. And that's why he's here now, because he's kind of an outcast of the scientific community and is driven by this desire to prove that he was right. And so the cool thing about this is that them meeting with him really comes down to this discussion that like he was attacked by somebody. He can't really provide any details about it. He didn't really see what happened. He just knows that like he woke up and somehow he survived, and you know, he believes that it was one of those mutants that exist out there. But following this leads to a kind of, I guess, a bit of detective work by Mystique, where she takes on the guise of an innocent young woman and starts making her way through the city of London when she hears somebody scream. And when she gets there, she finds Sinister killing a guy. And so that's when literally she fires a shot at him. He realizes she can shapeshift, so she basically, her existence verifies that he's right, that there are people out there with powers, right? Although it was already kind of verified up to this point. He ultimately takes to the rooftops and then runs back to his base of operations. When Irene Adler, or when Destiny and Mystique catch up to him, they find him transforming from Sinister back into Essex. And that's when he comes clean with the explanation. Now, one of the things to understand, this is where we kind of get really more broadly into this origin, or really the finer details of this origin. In Marvel Comics, Sinister, of course, Nathaniel Essex, his obsession with the mutant gene, the idea that there are beings out there who have incredible levels of power, that was eventually noticed by the villain Apocalypse, right, in Sabah Nur. That's who he's talking about when he refers to as the Egyptian who visited him and granted him powers. The idea of Sinister, or really Nathaniel Essex, meeting Apocalypse and explaining to Apocalypse his belief system that those individuals with powers are basically the next step in human evolution, that was something Apocalypse had never considered before. All Apocalypse knew was that he was just a being with incredible power and used that to effectively force societies against each other. He had followed the old social Darwinist philosophy that was instilled in him by Ball and the Sand Riders, which is only the strong deserve to survive. But when he met Sinister, and Sinister's argument was, there are people out there with incredible power, they can do incredible things, and they will lead the world into arguably a better future, maybe not necessarily better, but a different future, that Apocalypse kind of took that to heart and was like, so that's why I have the powers that I have. He almost saw it as a kind of like divine intervention, right? A divine purpose for himself. And this almost religious zealotry merged with his viewpoint of survival of the fittest. And that's how we ended up with the version of Apocalypse that we have today in Marvel Comics. But in order to ensure, because Nathaniel wanted to literally spend all of time being able to explore these genes and so on, that Apocalypse basically told Nathaniel Essex he would give him the means to do so. Now, the reality here is that when Apocalypse shows up to you and says, I can give you a great gift, it's like being met by like Pinhead in the Hellraiser universe, right? Like the Cenobites. Like, I mean, sure, right? They have sights to show you, and they can take you to a new place of pleasure that you could never imagine, but it's a dark and twisted version, right? It's literally just pain and torment. And so because of that, it's one of those things where the gifts, quote unquote, of Apocalypse oftentimes prove to be more of a curse than anything else. And so what you're seeing here right now in terms of Nathaniel Essex having this almost kind of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation where the Mister Sinister persona is like the evil one and Nathaniel Essex is the good one, it's basically the quote-unquote gift of Apocalypse, or him gaining these powers, really overriding him. But what he's readily admitting here is that the Sinister persona is taking hold. He's moving beyond his ability to control this version of himself. That a time's going to come when something's going to happen, and ultimately the Sinister persona is going to completely and totally take hold. More so than that, he literally argues that just by being a scientist and being able to just look to the future and see what direction things are going in, these individuals popping up, right, what he calls the Essex Men, or basically mutants, is really what that means, that where they're popping up, kind of here and there, and it's a smattering of appearances, that by whatever manner and whatever means, the number of mutants in the world will increase. And what that's going to do is set humanity and the mutant population on a collision course. They're going to go to war with each other, if for no other reason than the fact that the rise in mutants will represent the elimination of humans. And so what he talks about is how he wants to survive and see all of that, but at the end of the day, it seems like it'll be impossible, that he's toying with the idea that he will inevitably die and perhaps even take his own life because of the fact that he doesn't want to become Sinister. And so what he says is he set in motion a way to guarantee his existence. But because of the level of insanity that he's putting out there, and because of the fact that according to Destiny, he represents a clear and present danger, that what ends up happening is he's literally locked in an insane asylum, but where he starts babbling on and he literally starts saying like red and black and just kind of talking to himself constantly, seeing a person that's not there, he refers to them as a ghost, and then he's ultimately destroyed. Like, he literally dies in the middle of the night. And so where Mystique pretending to be Sherlock Holmes shows up here, bribes a guard, and then realizes the guard is corrupt, killing them, so that there's no witnesses to anything, and any story they can imagine can be concocted here. That what happens is Irene Adler goes back to Mulberry House and literally explores the residence of Nathaniel Essex. But she puts on what is basically a recording of Nathaniel where he talks about these different things. And so he says, Darwin said I was wrong, but I was never so proud as to say the same to him. His insight was profound. This is what my legacy will be. This is how I will be immortal and to see how the world will play out. This is how we'll win the war against humanity when they try to destroy the mutant population. Charles Darwin was right. In the end, there is only one way to find a solution to my predicament: survival of the fittest. And so what we end up finding out here is that there are 4 canisters down in the basement of Sinister. And what he had done is he had cloned himself 4 times, that each one basically has a playing card on his head. This is why this is so important, because in Jerry Dugan's X-Men Volume 2, the Stasis storyline, we saw a version of Sinister that had a clover on his head. He didn't have a diamond. And so that version was literally like, I'm the only Sinister. I've always been Sinister. I don't know what other version of Sinister you're talking about. There's also one with a spade, there's one with a heart, and there's one with a diamond. And so what this means, and what Marvel's telling us, is every instance where we've seen Mister Sinister in Marvel from this point in time in 1895 running all the way up until now, it's only been one of the 4 Sinisters. There have been 4 others out there. They are 3 others out there, and they've just been doing their thing. We've never seen them, or seemingly never seen them, and they don't know about each other. Or if they do, they're certainly not revealing it. But like all of them believes they're the actual Sinister. So if they did happen to come across another, or if they became aware of another, they would consider it to be some inferior clone and would probably disregard it. They wouldn't really care about it at all. But basically, it's amazing because no version of Sinister that we've seen up to this point is the actual Nathaniel Essex. That guy's been dead for a couple hundred years. He's been gone for a long time, and all we've seen are clones running around. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are covering the Sins of Sinister. Now, here's the thing to understand. The Sins of Sinister is a crossover event. It is 9 issues long. The first 3 issues are year 10, the second 3 is year 100, and the final 3 is year 1000. Now, it doesn't really tie into any existing X-Men comics, meaning it's not Sins of Sinister, X-Men number whatever. However, we need to get caught up on the X-Men. So after we're done with this, we're going to get caught back up, which is what we should have been doing this whole time because I love the X-Men, but you can understand this without knowing everything that's going on. So the first thing that happens here is basically Sinister is dragged to the pit of Krakoa, literally taken prisoner and locked away. Now, we don't need to know everything that's going on in order to understand the rest of this story, because honestly, this is the least interesting thing that happens. This story gets nuts, but we will make sense of why this happens once we go back and start covering the various X-Men titles and getting caught up. One of the big takeaways from all this is that after this is done, when you have Charles Xavier, basically him removing his helmet, you end up finding out that he's got a Sinister diamond on his head. Now, what this is designed to do is to basically illustrate the idea that Xavier himself is under the influence of Sinister. But it's not even just Professor Xavier. Emma Frost, Exodus, Hope Summers, they're all under the influence of Sinister. So we don't know exactly how he did this. We will find out in this story, but we don't know exactly how he did this here in the moment. The bigger discussion that goes on here is the question of what do they do now that the seats, or so many seats in the Quiet Council, are empty, right? The ruling governing body of the X-Men on the mutant island of Krakoa. Now, some of the things that led to this, we have already covered. So when you had like the Inferno event where it turned out that Moira McTaggart, the one who had set all this up in the first place, that she had put together the plan of Krakoa and giving mutants a safe haven, because what she wanted to do, and having died and lived a new life so many times, she literally always saw that no matter what happened, there was always a war between humans and mutants, or humans and like some alien race or something like that, but the mutant population was always wiped out. No matter what happened, mutants were always destroyed. And so her idea was that in order to keep that from happening, by having the Quiet Council and the resurrection protocols and all that kind of stuff, over time, as different X-Men were resurrected, they'd be resurrected without their powers, and that would lead to them being forced out of Krakoa, and over time, it would reduce the number of mutants that exist in the world. Hence the reason why Krakoa was presented as a safe haven for the entirety of the mutant population, because it was a really simple and elegant way for Moira to effectively genetically remove mutants, or at least genetically remove the mutant gene from the human population, therefore preventing the end-all destruction of the mutant population. So it was pretty wild, and depending on where you stand morally, you may or may not agree with it. But of course, at the end of that story, there were a few things going on. One, Sinister, of course, is currently part of the Quiet Council, or was until he was taken away. And again, we'll get caught up on why that happened. But with the events of Inferno and Moira McTaggart, that Destiny, the mutant precognitive, the one who can basically predict the future, she and Mystique, who of course have been longtime lovers in Marvel Comics, they left, right? So a lot of these seats are empty here. So the discussion that's being asked by Professor Xavier and Emma Frost and these guys is, why don't we fill these seats with humans? Now, for the most part, this is almost completely and totally shut down by Exodus, but he ends up changing his mind once Hope Summers agrees with it. Now, this is not like Exodus being a simp, right? I know some people may have like that knee-jerk reaction. See, without having any evidence about the character whatsoever, or knowing nothing about his motivations, I've drawn a complete and total, unquestionable conclusion. The reality when it comes to Exodus, if you've been reading the X-Men for a while, is that he's not in love with Hope. The idea here is that he sees Hope as basically the Messiah, a guy godlike being, and rightfully so, right? It was with the birth of Hope Summers in Marvel Comics that the X-Men, or really mutants, started to return to Marvel Comics after the events of House of M and Decimation, when the Scarlet Witch took away 98% of the mutant population's powers, right? Effectively wiped out most of the mutant population. And so when this is initially thrown out there, for the most part, the Quiet Council actually starts to agree with it. And the reason why is because what they want to do is they want to basically impose this way of conquering the world. Now, we'll see how this unfolds over the course of this, because I'll be honest with you guys, it's a genius strategy and it's a genius plan, because what they do here is by bringing human beings onto the Quiet Council, one, that begins to quell the concern of different governments out there about what the mutants are up to, by giving them a peek on the inside of the island of Krakoa, and in fact, allowing them a seat on the governing body. It gives human beings the illusion of control. And so what we do is we jump forward 1 year, and we have reporter Ben Urich meeting with J. Jonah Jameson from the Spider-Man comics at the Daily Bugle. Now, the funny thing here is that Ben Urich is being incredibly careful here, right? Exceedingly cautious. And the reason for this is that as he meets with J. Jonah Jameson, he injects him with a kind of chemical. And what this does is it's basically designed to see who is infected with the X gene that's circulating around out there and who's not. And so what ends up happening is that once it turns out that J. Jonah Jameson is seemingly his normal self, Ben Urich spills the beans on everything that he's discovered. And what he learned is that when human beings were brought onto the Quiet Council, that what the mutant population started doing was handing out these different genes, right, that could prolong life, different things like that, kind of an upgraded version, so to speak, of the different medicines and stuff that Krakoa had. But what it secretly did is it planted a gene inside of human beings that would allow them at any point in time to be overtaken by the mutant population. It's a Trojan horse. And so when that happened, what you started seeing was that people who were their normal selves but had the gene would suddenly switch, right? A switch would kind of flick in their head, and they would become basically an agent of the mutant population. Really, by extension, an agent of Sinister, sort of doing their own thing or doing whatever it is they were told to do. And so that's literally when Ben Urich's like, I mean, I've spotted that with a few people here and there, but I mean, what if it's like politicians, right? Senators and congressmen, congresswomen, right? What do we do in that kind of situation, right? Some dictator out there somewhere, right? People who run entire countries could be compromised and under control of the mutant population. And that's when we end up finding out that J. Jonah Jameson is under control with the Sinister gene. That the idea here is that the test that was used by Ben Urich was a false test that was leaked out there so that people who were, by and large, looking at this as a kind of nefarious act would leap on that opportunity to expose the truth to the world. It's a very, very smart move, right? Just basically throw out a reel, add a little bit of bait, and then bring them in, and then have them taken over by the gene. And that's what happens with Ben Urich. It is, to a degree, if we're being honest, the plot to the film, oh my god, what is that movie with the Invasion of the Body Snatchers? That's basically what this is to a degree. And so the bigger concern that they have here is, okay, what do we do about the mutant nation of Krakoa, right? The living island. What do we do about this, right? I mean, this is literally a living island that can at any point in time make the entire environment inhospitable to us, right? It can just start filling the air with some kind of a toxic gas that can kill us, right? It's like M. Night Shyamalan's The Happening, right? Where plants are killing people. Like, that's basically the concern they have. So Forge ends up inventing or creating this cannon that can be fired from a satellite that will basically lobotomize Krakoa. And that's exactly what happens. They fire this cannon, they take out the mutant island of Krakoa, and that's when the X-Men make their move. That Emma Frost telepathically broadcasts to the world. Because one of the things that the X-Men is sort of built on is by having this gene, right? Telling humanity, if you have this gene, that means we can back up you and your loved ones. This also comes out of the events of Judgment Day, right? That's when humanity learned that the X-Men had like the resurrection protocols. People were pissed off because the X-Men basically had the ability to bring the dead back to life with all their memories, and humanity wanted that. That's what the X-Men are building on here. And so that's when Emma Frost broadcasts to the world. She says, the Orcus space station, right? This group that's been out there since the beginning of Jonathan Hickman's run that has been working against the mutant population for a while. Think of them as like the modern day interpretation of like Friends of Humanity or like the Right or something like that, right? Like the Purifiers to a degree. But they literally say like the Orcus space station has laid an attack against Krakoa, and by attacking our island, they've destroyed not only the backups for us as X-Men, but the backups for all your human loved ones. So we need to strike back against the Orcus station. Literally, they fabricate an attack and use that as really an excuse to wipe out their own enemy by having everybody else come under this false pretense. And so literally what happens here, of course, also Douglas Ramsey's killed by Wolverine because Douglas Ramsey can kind of figure out what's going on, right? He's the one that talks to the mutant island of Krakoa. But what ends up happening here is under the false pretense that Orchis led the attack, that during this 1-year time jump, the X-Men bring together the Avengers and a whole host of other superheroes and launch an attack against Orchis. Now, the one thing that could stand in their way and the one thing that could annihilate all of them is Nimrod, right? The ultimate sentinel, the machine that has the ability to recognize their powers and adapt to those powers as well as use their weaknesses. So Tony Stark ends up developing a virus, or really along with Reed Richards and Forge, end up developing a virus that infiltrates Nimrod and takes Nimrod offline. So he's no longer part of the equation. But all of these guys are doing it under false pretenses. The X-Men are the only ones who are aware of what's going on. That whole thing with like Ben Urich and J. Jonah Jameson, it's all super hush-hush at the moment, right? Nobody really understands or realizes the X-Men are slowly starting to take over the world. And so in this meeting, or in the aftermath of this battle, where you have Cyclops talking to Captain America, Cyclops literally says, Cap, it's awesome to fight by you again, right? Like, you've earned yourself a place as an honorary X-Men, which in this time, in this landscape, when the X-Men are so kind of cut off from the world, that's a huge honor, right? It's like being made an honorary member of the Avengers like 40 years ago in Marvel Comics. It's a big deal. And so Captain America, of course, accepts the invitation. Captain America comes under the control of the X-Men. And so what ends up happening here is that following all of this, that Sinister is brought back from the pits. And now Sinister is effectively sort of running the show to a degree, or at least kind of enjoying everything that they're doing. What Sinister does is that while the Quiet Council is continuing their campaign of essentially trying to take over the world by infiltrating people and turning them into what are basically mind-controlled people, Sinister ends up going to his own private lab. And what he does in talking to the lab is he says, with everything going the way that it is, give me a projection on how things are going to play out, right? Give me a projection on what the future of the world is going to look like because of all of this. And this is when things get really, really cool. So one of the first things that happens is we end up learning that Thanos will inevitably launch another attack against Earth, and that he's actually just sort of traveling through the time stream. And so what ends up happening is the Juggernaut is shrunk down to a miniature size, and then Hope Summers borrows the powers of Domino, which is important because Domino has the ability to bend luck to her side. And so Hope Summers, using basically the ability to manipulate luck, fires Juggernaut from a cannon, and because once the Juggernaut starts moving, he cannot be stopped, the Juggernaut literally punches a hole through Thanos and kills Thanos as he's moving through the time stream. Now, eventually, Juggernaut re-enters into the main universe after exiting the time stream, but is just continuing to fly out there in a direction, and nobody ever makes an effort to go and get him. So he's just essentially flying towards the edge of the universe where he'll ultimately be destroyed. Following that, Doctor Doom ends up figuring out what's going on with the mutant population taking over the world through mind control, and he ends up allying himself with Namor the Submariner, because Namor, of course, is spewing a bunch of anti-mutant rhetoric. What Victor Von Doom doesn't know is that Namor the Submariner has been converted as well, and that it was all a ruse to get Victor Von Doom on his side. When that happens, he kills Doctor Doom secretly, right, just stabbing him with a trident, and then following that, the Eternals start to realize what's happening, and so because of the events at the end of Judgment Day, the peace treaty that was struck between the X-Men and the Eternals at the end of the Judgment Day story is that the X-Men would have control of Uranos, right, the once ancient Eternal that was nigh unstoppable and was unleashed during that event and wiped out a huge portion of the mutant population. With Uranos under their control in the Eternal X-Men War, the X-Men from basically all over the place end up unleashing Uranos, who wipes out the entirety of the Eternals. Now, because the Eternals themselves can be resurrected, in order to prevent that from happening, the Eternals are put in stasis and launched into deep space. So now they're no longer part of the equation. Following that, the X-Men's attention turns to the Fantastic Four. And the concern is that because Reed Richards is so intelligent, if he hasn't figured out what's going on right now, he inevitably will. Given his level of intelligence, he would have figured this out pretty quickly. But one of the things to remember about Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four is he's very very rarely ever concerned about what goes on with Earth because you have so many superhero groups that are there. So if there is some kind of a major threat, the Fantastic Four will get involved. But in Marvel Comics, in terms of Fantastic Four stories that have been published, for the longest time, they've been the spacefaring, multiverse exploring team, right? That's kind of their frontier. That's where they focus on things. Because dealing with Earth's small time stuff, they've done that dance. They've done their dirt. They've served their time. And so what ends up happening here is realizing that the different members of the Fantastic Four all have their strengths and weaknesses. Ben Grimm is the one who's the most easily overtaken by the X-Men, and he is. It allows him to revert to his human form, and then in turn, the Fantastic Four are kind of sent on a false mission by the X-Men and by Ben Grimm. And during that mission, the X-Men actually help Ben Grimm devise a scheme whereby the other members of the Fantastic Four are all turned into Ben Grimm's. He in turn strangles them all to death, and that's the end of them. And so following that, with Captain America under control of the X-Men, he in turn strikes at the White House, takes out the president, and then what the X-Men do is they attack the Avengers, because at this point, all the Avengers have all been taken over. So with the Avengers launching an attack against the US government, the X-Men step in, they defeat the Avengers, and they're hailed as heroes. That's the beauty of this, is literally they kept pushing the Avengers to do these more and more extreme tasks. So by the time they launched an attack against the White House, the general population who hadn't been taken over and wasn't aware that this takeover was happening would kind of be like, yeah, I guess it was only a matter of time before the Avengers did something crazy like that. Thank God the X-Men saved us. That's the idea. That's the motivation. So the X-Men are hailed as heroes of the world. Now, the cool thing here is we jump forward 5 years, right? We pick up in year 5. Everything we've talked about so far is within 1 year. It's a 1 year span, right? 1 year into the future. So 5 years into the future, Storm arrives. And Storm, of course, is the leader of the Iraqi. They have their whole history and everything. But basically, they are a massive group of mutants that we didn't know existed until Jonathan Hickman started writing the X-Men. They initially existed in another dimension, but once they ended up arriving in the main Marvel Universe, they took up residence on Mars and they formed their own government. Storm eventually became the leader of that circle, right? That's what they call their governing body on Mars, and it's just kind of been operating as their leader ever since. But with all of this happening, Storm is watching everything taking place, and she's realizing how extreme the X-Men are becoming and the kind of battles they're getting into, and she's not trusting them. More so than that, what she realizes is that the Nightcrawler that's currently there is not the actual Nightcrawler. He's an impersonator. And so when she asks the question, where is the real Nightcrawler, that's when Sinister presents himself. Now, one thing to know is that Storm was not on the Quiet, or at least was on the Quiet Council when Sinister was locked away, but she didn't know that everybody else was being taken over by the Sinister gene. So to the best of her knowledge, Sinister's in the pit. That's where he's supposed to be. She doesn't know that he was released by the X-Men. And so literally she's like, okay, why is he here, right? He's supposed to be in the pit. Not only that, when he does reappear, what he shows is that he's been tampering with the genes of Nightcrawler and turned him into this kind of grotesque beast. And so he's like, the Nightcrawler that's been with you is the one that I created, so I could tamper with the real Nightcrawler and screw up his genes, and you would never know the difference. So you got an option. Either you can deal with this puppet that I have installed and you can just kind of go from there. You can join our cause, or we can take you out. And so what ends up happening is that with Storm, and one of the reasons why she was able to avoid all this is incredibly simple. So what Sinister had been doing when it came to him taking over and everybody being infiltrated, what Sinister had done is he had modified the resurrection machine. And what would happen is that every time a mutant was killed and resurrected, they would be secretly infected with the Sinister gene. That's how he was able to take everybody over. Storm was not infected by that, because if you guys remember during Judgment Day, Storm got rid of her backup in the resurrection protocols, so that if she dies, she stays dead. There's no conceivable way of bringing her back. Magneto also did the same thing. And so the result of this is that Storm is not infected because she hasn't been resurrected since the tampering was done by Mister Sinister. And so in response to that, because they can't simply just kill her, because ultimately if the Quiet Council killed Storm, it would ultimately result in a civil war because she's so respected by mutants on both sides, especially the ones that haven't been taken over yet. And so what ends up happening is that Professor Xavier and Emma Frost use their telepathy to try to control the mind of Storm. And so what we end up doing is transitioning back, or kind of jumping back to a bit of a flashback when Storm is meeting with Lactuca, I think is how you pronounce their name. But Lactuca is basically a member of the Great Ring of Araco, right? The governing body of Mars, basically. And everybody on the governing body of Mars is an Omega level mutant, which of course means that they're some of the most powerful mutants in existence. With Lactuca, or Lactuca, however you pronounce it, that basically they have the ability to know everything that's going on, right? Just universal, maybe even multiversal awareness. But more so than that, they house like an infinite number of minds. And the result of this is that when they basically back up the mind of Storm, what it means is that when Xavier and Emma Frost launch their telepathic attack, it's not just trying to take over the mind of Storm, it's trying to take over an infinite number of minds at the same time, which of course they can't do. It's one person standing on a beach trying to hold back a tidal wave that's 300 feet tall and 500 feet wide, right? It's not gonna happen, you know what I mean? You're just gonna be engulfed by that thing, and that's gonna be the end of you. And so this basically allows Storm to go without being infected by Xavier and Emma Frost. She casts down this amazing lightning bolt, and she's just like, abominations, right? Imposters, and then takes off, right? Literally just leaves. And so that's when she comes to the realization, this is war, right? That's basically what this is. This is now a civil war among the mutants, those who are infected and those who are not. Now, the cool thing about this is that as Storm makes, like, she literally readies her forces, she's met by the arrival of Destiny and Mystique. Remember, Destiny can see the future. She's a precog. It's not all etched in stone. So if Destiny comes to you and says, this is gonna happen in 5 minutes, it's the absolute truth. If she comes to you and says, this is gonna happen in 5 years, it may or may not happen, because a lot of things can take place between now and 5 years. So again, it's not an absolute prediction, but she is the most trusted precog that's out there. But she tells Storm, if you go and attack the X-Men now, you are guaranteed to lose. We have to bide our time. We have to wait. And so the result of this is that we transition to essentially Sebastian Shaw of the Hellfire Club. Now, Sebastian Shaw has been kind of a background character for quite some time, but he becomes an emissary to the realms of hell, right? To the realms of limbo. But what this does is it allows the X-Men to conquer all the different hell realms, right? The realms of Mephisto and all those different guys. Beyond that, you have Magic, who actually, or at least Illyana Rasputin, who ends up making a deal on behalf of the X-Men with Surtur from Muspelheim. Because what had happened is that when the Avengers became more and more extreme, leading up to them attacking the US government, Thor ultimately vacated. He abandoned the Avengers, heartbroken, and ended up just residing in Asgard and staying there seemingly permanently. But with Magic making a deal with Surtur in order to destroy Asgard, she gets the Twilight Sword, which is literally the sword of Ragnarok, right? Like, that's the sword Surtur would use to wipe out everything in Asgard. She shows up here using her magical abilities and destroys Asgard, and the Asgardians are cast out into the abyss, never to be seen or heard from again. On top of that, Sinister and the X-Men, they wipe out Wanda Maximoff, right? They destroy the Scarlet Witch. Because remember, during the events of House of M, leading up to House of M, she had the ability to alter reality on a universal scale. She could set everything back. And so what ends up happening during this time is that Sinister, right, like, you know, continuing to skip forward through time, Sinister ends up using the Westchester Institute, the Xavier School for Gifted Youngsters, as a gigantic lab. And he literally starts splicing together the genes of different mutants into like a singular body. So you might have like the genes of Colossus that are merged with the genes of Nightcrawler. So you have like Night Colossus, which is kind of an awesome name, if I'm being honest with you guys, right? Okay, so here's what I want you guys to do. Here's what I want you guys to do. Leave a comment down below with like spliced names, right? So like if you were gonna merge like Wolverine and Cyclops, or like if you were gonna name the merger of like Nightcrawler and Colossus, give me those names, man, because I really want to see them, right? I think it would be awesome. But using these spliced genes, what it does is it allows the X-Men to become more powerful than they ever were before, because now they possess multiple powers. So an army composed of 100 X-Men suddenly becomes what is in effect 200 X-Men, because each one of those X-Men now has 2 powers. 100 times 2 is 200. So literally that's one of the crazy things, because when that happens, an attack is launched by Sinister, the X-Men, and all those guys against the forces of Storm. right? All those guys out there. And so what we end up doing is jumping forward 10 years. And what we end up finding out here is that the human population is by and large aware of what's going on, but they don't care, right? They realize like they want to be a part of this greater thing. That Sinister has kind of created the peaceful coexistence between humans and mutants, but he's done it in a nefarious way. He's done it through mind control, right? He's done it through conquering and all that kind of stuff. It's kind of nuts. And so what we end up doing is basically picking up during this 10-year time jump when Sinister is meeting with the Quiet Council, and the Quiet Council actually reveals that what they've been doing is modifying the programming of the Sinister gene in each one of themselves so they don't operate as a slave of Mister Sinister. Instead, they operate as their own individual person doing their own individual thing. They still operate under the guise of, or at least still operate with the idea of the X-Men conquering everything, but they're not like dogs on a leash for Sinister. You know what I mean? But in effect, this leads Sinister to realize he's lost control of the people that he's supposed to be controlling. He's lost control of the Quiet Council. They have too much free will. And so what his intention is to basically go back and wipe the entire project, right? Literally wipe them all out. And that'll basically be it. And then effectively start over. The issue is that once he gets back there, he realizes the entirety of his lab is gone. His ability to rework this whole process doesn't exist anymore. Someone's stolen his lab. And so in effect, he's now trapped down here. There's no conceivable means for him to escape. So he literally loses control of his own project. He always ends up losing here. And that's where it sends a Sinister leaf. Let me know what, okay. Do we need to cover the rest of this? Because it's not completely done yet, right? Like, it's still coming out on a monthly basis, so I don't know exactly how long it'll take to finish. But, like, do we need to cover this, man? Because honestly, this story is dope. It's one of the most interesting stories I've seen with the X-Men in so long. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Sins of Sinister, and I love this story. Oh my god. Now, one of the things to remember, right, these three number ones that we've done so far, Storm and the Brotherhood, Nightcrawlers, which is coming out later this week, and then this one, Immoral X-Men, this all takes place in the first 10 years. The number twos that are going to be coming out take place during 100 years, and then the final 3 issues take place at 1,000 years. So again, 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years. So during this 10-year window, which is really when the X-Men first start taking over everything and conquering the world, that we basically have an attempt by really Nick Fury, and I don't know if I'd call them his Howling Commandos, but basically what's left of S.H.I.E.L.D., launching a strike force against Westchester in order to take down the ability for the X-Men to effectively control everybody, right? The Cerebro satellite in the sky that kind of monitors everything that everybody has going on all the time. Now, one of the crazy things about this is that as Nick Fury and them begin to launch their mission and they jump out of this window, their brains shut down and they smash into the ground and die, only for us to find out Xavier had basically screwed with their heads. This is nuts, man. It's one hell of a way to open a comic book, to be honest with you guys. I love it. Like, I absolutely love the way this was done. Now, the funny thing about this is that this is literally just Xavier saying another cell's gone. And that's what's cool about this, because what it shows us is that when it comes to these different rogue factions that are trying to work against the X-Men in order to stop them from conquering the world, that some of them have the ability to dodge the influence of Professor Xavier and other telepaths. Now, that's not unheard of. Anybody who's been reading X-Men for any real measure of time knows, and honestly, I would say using tech to overcome the power of telepaths, that didn't really become a big thing until the 90s. You saw people doing it during the run of Chris Claremont back during the 70s and the 80s, but in truth, the 90s is when like everything in Marvel was like super high octane, fast paced, and like all kinds of high tech stuff. And so during this time, it was not uncommon to see people overcome the power of telepaths using technology. Psi scans is what they would, or at least psi shields is what they would call them. But the cool thing about this is that Xavier, having done this, he actually kind of starts to cry, because even though what they're doing is quote unquote in the eyes of the X-Men bringing about a kind of peace to the world that otherwise wouldn't exist, it still brings them a lot of anguish to know that they're simply just wiping people out. And his stance is really more like, why can't they just succumb to our dream? Now, it's kind of a funny thing, because depending on where you stand morally, you can kind of take one side or the other, right? Like, Xavier tried to do the dance. He tried to do the whole thing where it's like, let's work together, guys, and humanity didn't want to do it. it. So the response of Xavier is, well, if you don't want to do it willingly, then we will make you, right? We will make you accept our existence. Now, the undercurrent here, and it's one of the things to keep in mind, Sinister isn't really controlling all of them, but they are operating more based on what Sinister would do as opposed to anything else. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, is because that'll be a main focal point as we get through this. But unlike Xavier, who still maintains his humanity, Emma Frost doesn't care. And that's one of the things. Emma Frost has always been cold-blooded. And this comic is actually just going to lay Emma Frost bare. Not literally, but you are going to see like Emma Frost for who she is, and really just how cunning and dark she can be. And so it's really kind of a funny thing, because what ends up happening here is you have a Quiet Council, or at least the Quiet Council, that's brought together by Emma Frost. And one of the things they initially do is they kind of ask the question of Hope Summers, why do you have a cybernetic arm? Now, the reason why Hope Summers does this is because it's paying tribute to Cable. Remember, Cable's not dead, but he defected from the X-Men, and he joined Storm's Brotherhood, and is kind of doing his thing at this point in time, working against the attempt of Sinister to conquer everything. Now, the reason why this matters, and we covered it, but truth to tell, we might go back and rework all that mid-2000s X-Men stuff after Decimation. But one of the things that happened here is that after Decimation, when all the mutants lost their, or really like 98% of the mutant population lost their powers due to the action of Scarlet Witch, Hope Summers was the first mutant born after that happened. Now, it did turn into a kind of cat and mouse game where the mutant Bishop was trying to kill Hope, Cable was trying to keep her safe. So literally, Cable was just taking Hope through time. They were jumping around the time stream, and Bishop was chasing after them. But the important thing is that Hope is viewed as the Messiah. But the fact that she was raised by Cable, in a lot of ways, she sees Cable as her father. This is even doubly important because of the fact that her parents were killed when she was a baby. So she never actually knew her parents. Cable's the only father figure she's ever known. So that's why you have such a strong father-daughter bond between the two of them. But the thing about this, and what's really kind of interesting here, is you switch over to Sinister. Now, Sinister, again, with a diamond on his head, remember, he's one of 4 Sinisters that exist out there, and none of them seem to be aware of the others. But what is important here, and what we saw at the end of the Sins of Sinister one-shot, is that what he was doing was cloning Moira McTaggart, so he could basically kill her if he needed to reset the time stream, because that's her power. And then he would basically remind himself of everything that was going on, and then restart this attempt to conquer the world in case something went awry. The problem with this, and as we know now from the Storm and the Brotherhood comic, Storm and her forces stole the cloning lab. They stole the secret lab of Sinister. And so what he's really trying to do here is figure out what comes next. Because without the ability to kill a Moira McTaggart and reset the time stream, he's stuck in this timeline until whatever degree it plays out. Now, one of the other things that's kind of funny here is that when he teleports back to just one of his safe havens, he's got those all over the world, but when he teleports back to one of them, he's basically got a clone of himself. He's not overly intelligent. It's really just a way for Sinister to just bounce ideas off of himself. But one of the things he makes a comment on is that he might go meet with Dark Beast. Now, here's the thing. I didn't even know Dark Beast existed anymore. Maybe I'm missing something, but as far as I'm aware, Dark Beast has been out of Marvel Comics for ages. If he is here, that's kind of a cool thing. For those of you guys who don't know the significance of that, back in the 1990s, Marvel had a comic called The Age of Apocalypse, which was a really, really fun and amazing comic book story. If you were a fan of the villain Apocalypse, and even like everybody else in Marvel, it was just really cool the way it was handled. The important thing here is that in that reality, instead of Beast being the more jovial member of the X-Men, who was like the science guy / cheerleader, so on and so forth, in the Age of Apocalypse, he was twisted. Like, he was really, really twisted, and he would perform like gruesome experiments on people. That's how he earned the name Dark Beast. But when the Age of Apocalypse timeline was ended, when that timeline was destroyed, Dark Beast was one of a precious few number of characters, which included, oh my God, Holocaust. He made it out. God, I loved his character. Oh my God, he was amazing. One of the best characters from the 90s that you've never heard of if you never grew up reading Marvel Comics in the 1990s. He was cool. He was a really, really cool concept. Of course, X-Man Nate Gray also escaped the timeline. I think Sugar Man did as well. I don't know of anybody else that made it out. But the important thing here is that Dark Beast made it out of the timeline and just kind of existed in Marvel for a little while. So again, I'm not 100% sure if Dark Beast is here. Maybe he is. But regardless, it is a cool little reference, right, to the potential fact that he is here. But at the end of the day, Sinister comes to the realization that only he can really trust himself to get out of that, because what he's done is he's created a kind of backup plan. This idea, at least under normal circumstances, is that he had what was called the Inferno Protocol, which was literally a doomsday button. He would just smash this button and it would kill everybody under his control. And then in turn, he could just go and reactivate the timeline if he needed to. But the reality here is that Doomsday button is in a secret lab. So literally any option he has to destroy these guys in one fell swoop is all basically gone. So he's got to do it piece by piece. And so he ends up showing up in the room of Emma Frost while she's sleeping with what's basically a lethal injection, goes to take her out, only for the needle to break. And that's when we end up finding out it's Emma Frost in her diamond form. More so than that, the reason why the needle broke on her skin is because she looked like she was in her normal form, but she wasn't. And what's actually been happening here is she's been holding Jason Wingard prisoner in her own room in order to basically trick anybody who comes in there into believing that she's just in her normal form. She literally keeps him hopped up on amphetamines all the time. The guy stays awake all the time, or really just kind of sleeps during the day, but like stays up all night long in order to ensure that she's protected, lest he fail to do his job and then pays the price, which would likely be psychic torture and then probably not being able to spend the night with Emma Frost anymore. So the thing about this is, and what's really crazy here is that Emma Frost, realizing what's going on, ultimately ends up attacking Sinister, or at least traveling back to capture Sinister once Sinister teleports away. Now, what's funny about this is that in response, not only has Sinister been combining the powers of different mutants into Chimera, he's also been combining them into weapons. So he literally has this gun that he uses that basically combines the power of Banshee and Cypher, in the sense that because Cypher can speak any language, he basically uses the gun to blast Emma Frost with a sonic blast, but the power of Cypher allows the gun to decipher exactly what frequency Emma Frost's diamond form is at, so that it can be broken. And that's kind of the crazy thing, is because he literally shatters her arm, and there's kind of a brief reprieve here, because one of the things that had gone on here is Sinister had come to the realization that if he really is going to try to take over the world, and he's going to use the X-Men to do it, and intended to keep them under his control, it was only a matter of time before somebody was able to kill them off. And so what he did, or at least what the X-Men seemed to do, was develop the Logan patch. Much like a nicotine patch, what the Logan patch does is it literally just kind of keeps your blood filled with Logan's healing factor. And so when Emma Frost reverts back to her human form, her arm regrows. So again, it's cool. I love that like Marvel is kind of taking all these little tidbits from all these characters and just combine them into just this incredibly amazing story. And so literally when Emma Frost heals herself, it's only a matter of time before she destroys Sinister. So Sinister pulls out yet another ace in the hole and unleashes these Cyclops Chimera. Basically, these different people out here who are effectively Sinister's rebranded version of the Nasty Boys. They were a team that Sinister had back in the day. They really gained their prominence during X-Men the Animated Series, is when like they became the most popular. But they were kind of like Sinister's second version of the Marauders, more or less. But the Nasty Boys were kind of like his own henchmen. But what he's done here is he's taken the optic blast of Cyclops and combine them into other people. For example, Groot seemingly has the ability to shoot optic blasts out of his eyes and other parts of his body, which I'm not gonna lie, it's kinda dope, like, to be honest with you guys. Like, that's pretty awesome. But literally, it's nuts, because somebody like Ruckus, for example, his eyes have been turned into an optic blast, or the ability to shoot optic blasts, but because the power of Ruckus was to emit a concussive scream from his mouth, that what would happen is an optic blast was attached to his mouth, which seemingly amplifies the power of the optic blast. So again, it's cool the way this was done. And it's really like Emma Frost, as she starts to manipulate these guys, is she's like, I know Cyclops inside and out. And in fact, I was in love with Cyclops for the longest time. And what she says is like, there's no version of Cyclops that exists out there that I cannot manipulate, that I cannot somehow trick into fighting himself in some capacity. So literally, using her telepathy, she gets into the mind of the Nasty Boys, and they all start attacking each other. And then she has like this amazing speech, right? She says, power is not what you are, power is what you do. True queens are self-made, not appointed. And whether those who bestow the titles are gods, scientists, or monarchs, Emma Frost kneels to no one, and everyone kneels to me. I am the divine Emma Frost, and you've never been higher than dying red-faced before me. It's pretty awesome, because here's the thing. Emma Frost is one of these characters where like she exists in Marvel and she does some stuff sometimes, but she's never quite gotten her due the way that she deserves. And I'm still waiting for a story that Marvel does where Emma Frost is elevated to this massive prominence. Because let's be honest with ourselves, during Civil War, they established that Emma Frost is more powerful than Professor Xavier. So it's only a matter of time before Marvel could write a story and it would legitimately be believable where Emma Frost either conquers the world or kills the Marvel Universe or something like that, because she's an Omega level telepath. Woe betide the poor soul that crosses Emma Frost with nefarious intent, right? It's amazing, like the way her character functions. But she ultimately overpowers Nathaniel Essex, and then what he does is he reveals to her that with these chimera that he's created, where he can combine two powers, that given his research, he's developed the ability to put 5 powers in one individual person. Now imagine that for a second, because when you look at characters like Hope Summers, who's an Omega level mutant and has the ability to duplicate the powers of anybody she meets, and then presumably hold on to those powers forever, or somebody like Rogue, who can touch a person and then absorb their consciousness, or at least in the years leading up to the Hecatome storyline, where she could actually absorb multiple powers into her own body, right? Like, that makes them a force to be reckoned with. And that's what Sinister's talking about creating here. The most powerful mutants to ever exist in the history of the Marvel Universe. It's an astronomical situation, right? And so Emma Frost realizing not only that this could be done, but she could actually have it done to herself. She comes to this realization, and even when Sinister says, you're all gonna end up waging war against each other, right? Like, absolute power corrupts absolutely. You're all working together now, but it's only a matter of time before those eyes of compromise turn into eyes of envy, and you all start looking at each other like, well, when are they gonna make a move against me? And paranoia sets in, and you destroy yourselves. But Emma Frost, looking at this, comes to the realization that if she's able to attain the right combination, possibly before anybody else does, she could take over the world. She could kill everybody, and she could literally conquer the world on her own, and there'd be no one to stand in her way. And so what she does is she convenes a meeting of the Quiet Council and then gives them a kind of telepathic brief on everything that's transpired, of course probably leaving out a few details involving her own machinations, and then asks the question, do we allow Nathaniel Essex to continue with his experiments, or do we kill him, or possibly even submit him down to the great chasm, right, to the abyss? And the result of the Quiet Council, the verdict is, we let him continue. So they welcome him back into their ranks, but Sinister's on a short leash. And while Emma Frost doesn't say it in so many words, the reality is that Nathaniel Essex's days are numbered, right? Like, once he finishes this, unless he's able to present an even better scenario, unless he's able to basically provide himself or prove himself as a person that has any kind of contribution that matters to the Quiet Council, if he can't do that, they're going to take him out, right? And as we know from Sins of Sinister, the one-shot, they ultimately do. So it's a really, really cool situation. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are here with the first part of Sins of Sinister, and this story is amazing. Okay, so check this out. So one of the things to remember with Sins of Sinister is that what Mister Sinister had been doing is that, one, there's 4 of them, not just one, and each one believes that they are like the main Sinister. But the Sinister that we know with the diamond on his head, that he had basically been duping the X-Men, that every time an X-Men was killed and then brought back to life, or really any mutant was killed and brought back to life, that they had a gene planted inside of them that would allow Sinister to take control of them, right, to literally control their mind. And so what we saw in the original one-shot that set all this in motion is that over the years in Marvel Comics going into the future, that Sinister had used this to basically conquer the world, and then ultimately his creations essentially turned against him. So what this does is this basically picks up in the time when the X-Men are conquering everything. It is really like a civil war in a lot of ways. And the reason why is because this one focuses on Storm. So what we know about Storm for the most part is that she resides on Mars. She's like the queen of the Iraqi people, the other half of the mutant population that we simply didn't know existed. But in the early days of Sinister's forces taking over the world, that as they were going through and attacking different groups, one of the first groups they attacked were the group of the Iraqi on Mars, because they're some of the most powerful mutants in existence. So getting rid of them as fast as possible is the best way to kind of clear the landscape and make conquest easier for Sinister and all of his forces. And so what Storm talks about here is that she recalls back to when the Quiet Council seemed to be getting more and more extreme. She didn't actually know that Sinister had been controlling them. She just felt like the Quiet Council had moved away from trying to turn Krakoa into a place where mutants could reside in safety from the mutant population, and it started going on a mission of conquest. And so once Storm had realized that Sinister was controlling the Quiet Council, she immediately retreated when she realized there was no way to destroy them. But when Destiny, the precognitive, showed up and told her now was not the time to attack, that Storm started marshaling her forces. And initially, they were just gonna wait, right? They were gonna take Destiny's advice and just wait for the best time to attack. But of course, Sinister attacked them using Chimera. Now, Chimera are basically the examples of where Sinister is taking different mutants and merging them together. We'll learn more about that in the Nightcrawlers comic, which is amazing. Like, it looks like it's gonna be so cool. I'm so excited to read it. But of course, as you would expect, by having a chimera of mutants, the forces of Storm are almost completely and totally obliterated. And they have a whole host of people at their disposal. It includes Richard Rider Nova, people like that. But because blending Omega level mutants together, and in effect, they are greater than the sum of their parts, means the forces of Storm never really even had a chance. They never quite had a chance to even overcome these guys. And so all that's left here is death and destruction. The only thing that Storm and her forces, what's left of them, could possibly do was just flee for their lives. But with them just kind of out there and basically remaining hidden, the way this works is by way of WizKid. Now, WizKid we've talked about before, but it's kind of a refresher here. This is a kid that has the ability to create and control any kind of machinery he can possibly imagine. There's no limit there. So you could even argue he's way beyond Tony Stark or Reed Richards or any of those guys. But the long and short of this is that he was able to develop a cloaking device that would in effect hide Storm and her Brotherhood from the forces of Sinister. They'd never be able to locate them. And so what we end up finding out here is that Destiny has approached Storm yet again. But this time, Storm is a little more apprehensive because the last time she took Destiny's advice, they were ambushed and almost the entirety of her and her forces were eradicated. And so what's so crazy about this is that while this meeting is taking place between Storm and Destiny, that Storm asked this guy named John if it really is Destiny herself. And John's response is, it's not. Now, we don't really know anything about this guy. We'll talk about him here in a second, but he immediately attacks Destiny because he senses a few things. One, her energy signature is not the same. Her mannerisms are different, right? There are things about her body language and so on and so forth. None of it looks like Destiny or even sounds like Destiny if you're paying close enough attention. Now, when this guy makes his move, we end up finding out that it's not Destiny, it's actually Mystique. And this particular guy is named John Ironfire. Now again, we don't really know anything about him. He's just one of these mutants that seemingly existed out there in Krakoa. But Marvel heavily implies the idea that this guy is Omega level. In fact, Mystique literally asks, though I thought only Omegas could serve on the Great Ring, is this a rule that died with your planet? Or are you the Omega of molten metal blood? Now, there's different ways to interpret this. One is, of course, the rule that only Omega level mutants can serve on the Great Ring of Arakko is no longer intact. It's literally Storm just marshaling whoever she can and forming the council out of whoever's left. So being able to pick and choose about what person you have just isn't quite there. It could also be this guy quite literally is an Omega level mutant, and I would argue that is the latter. And the reason why is because John has the ability to create any metal in existence using his own blood. Now, there's nothing to directly indicate that he can or cannot create adamantium, but it's possible he could actually blend adamantium with other metals, mysterium or vibranium or something like that, and actually create a whole new form of metal that's never been seen before, that's more durable than adamantium or any of those. But the long and short of this, and the reason why this is so cool, is because what we end up getting is Mystique, who's here with a mission for Storm. Now, one of the things to know is that Storm, under any normal circumstance, would never jeopardize her forces. She would never jeopardize any of her guys, what's left of her forces. She would never send them on some kind of random errand. But what Mystique reveals here is the true power of Sinister. That with Sinister, it's not simply just taking everybody under mind control and then trying to to conquer the world. The reality here is he could fail multiple times for any number of reasons. And in light of the fact that he could fail, he has a kind of reset that he developed. Remember, one of the things that Jonathan Hickman established in his run on the X-Men, which we turned into a full story, it's like 13 hours if you haven't seen it already. There's a link to it down in the description. It covers the entirety of Jonathan Hickman's run of the X-Men. But one of the things he established is that Moira McTaggart, who in years past was just a mutant geneticist and a really good friend of Professor X, the leader of the X-Men, that she was actually a mutant. And her power is that every time she died, the timeline reset, and she would basically come back as her, but remembering everything that had happened before. This is Sinister's MacGuffin, right? It's his ace in the hole. If for whatever reason he were to fail, he can basically just activate one of the clones of Moira McTaggart and then kill her, and that'll reset everything. But Sinister will remember it all. He'll remember everything that that clone of Moira McTaggart remembers, basically everything that's happened. So it gives him the ability to kind of reset everything to zero, but correct the mistakes that he made. And so knowing this, that seemingly Storm comes to the realization of what Mystique is saying, that so long as the clones of Sinister are in his possession, there's no conceivable way they could win. There's no possible way they could come out on top. Every time they defeat Sinister, if he somehow manages to escape, one of the clones will die, everything will get reset, and they'll ultimately end up taking, or he'll ultimately end up launching his campaign all over again. And so with the face of that knowledge, there's only one thing Storm can do, which is launch an attack. Now this is when we get into the Brotherhood themselves, and in truth, it's composed of some pretty heavy hitters, right? So right off the bat, you've got Storm, who is of course an Omega level mutant that can control the weather on any world that she's on, and even manipulate weather that happens in space, right? Storms and different things like that. You've got Cable, who speaks for himself, right? For those of you guys who don't know who Cable is, he's one of the most powerful telepaths and telekinetics in the history of Marvel Comics. Korra, of course, is not Korra from The Legend of Korra, right? She's not a Bender or an Avatar, even though she was nowhere near as interesting as Kang. Not Kang, Aang, there we go. Kang the Conqueror, the last airbender, which is a story I would absolutely read. But Korra has the ability to boost the power of anybody in her vicinity and move it to a higher level. Of course, WizKid we've already talked about, Ironfire we've already talked about, Quick, basically Lulo Marshall, she's basically the fastest being that's still living, right? So seemingly, Quicksilver's no longer alive here. And then of course, you've got Mystique, who's not really officially part of the Brotherhood, but is just kind of there along for the ride. But the thing about this is that as everybody shows up here, right, once they arrive to where Sinister's base is, which is actually a Moira McTaggart's former base of operations, as soon as they show up there, we end up finding that Chimera are guarding the place. Specifically, it's Maggot and Marrow who have been merged into one. Now, this is crazy because one of the things Marrow was able to do in Marvel Comics, and she's basically old school, she could kind of grow bones out of her body that she could like throw at you, but Maggot had the ability, and really it was only came in the form of two, but he had these kind of maggots that would basically consume energy for him, but they could consume anything in existence. It didn't matter what it was. And that energy, once they consumed it, would be fed back into Maggot himself, which would basically either sustain him or even bolster his own abilities. But the thing about this is that by combining the two, it's quite literally having maggot bones thrown at you. These bones will be thrown at you and they will consume you. It's a pretty dangerous thing, right? Imagine somebody just throwing piranha that could eat anything in the world or anything in existence. Imagine them throwing those at you, and that's what you're facing off against right now. It's a pretty wicked combination, and I love the idea. Right? I honestly kind of hope this is going to be one of those Age of Apocalypse type things where like some of these folks survive into the main timeline when this kind of future ends or is somehow averted or whatever the case happens to be, and we get them going forward into the future of Marvel Comics, because it'd be amazing. Honestly, I can't really even remember the last time that I talked about like Maggot, Marrow, or any of those guys. But again, once Storm's forces overcome those Chimera, they get into the base base of operations, they meet even more. But the bigger issue here is that with the cloning system of Sinister, it's basically met with an impenetrable force field. And so the cool thing about this is that as this discussion goes down and as they're trying to figure out what to do here, what WizKid does is he comes up with this idea of, instead of trying to like take down the force field, which they just don't have time to do, to sit there and run like a whole bunch of algorithms and try to figure out the best and most effective way to do it because the forces are closing in, they can only hold them off for so long, that what ends up happening is that instead the Brotherhood basically teleports the whole system away, right? They teleport the entire cloning facility away. So during the Sins of Sinister one-shot, when Sinister came back to his base of operations and the entire cloning facility was gone, and then he was now stuck in this timeline, this is how it happened, right? It had seemingly happened quite some time before Sinister himself realized what was going on, right? Because by the time he realized that his cloning facility had gone, something like 50 years or so had passed, or 10 years or something to that effect. So it's been gone for quite a while. But the other part of this is that as Storm and WizKid are watching the system teleport and then preparing to make their leave, we end up finding out WizKid is not actually WizKid. That WizKid is Mystique impersonating WizKid. Not only that, here's the cool thing about this, right? She literally kind of taunts John by asking, were you able to figure out that it was me this time? And the reason for why John was able to deduce that it was not Destiny and actually Mystique was because Mystique allowed him to. And I imagine those of you guys who were probably watching this or listening to this or even read the comic when it first came out, you were kind of like, no way some random mutant is going to be able to figure out that like it's not Destiny and that it's actually Mystique unless there was some kind of telepath, because Mystique is far too adept at her powers to simply just figure out that it's someone else. Somebody like Wolverine could do it just by picking up scents. But then again, over the years in Marvel Comics, we've seen Mystique's abilities move to a place where she can even trick Wolverine. Now, the only real person out there who's a shapeshifter who's so capable that no one can really figure out who they are outside of some high-level telepath would be like Vanessa Carlyle, right? Like Copycat, the girlfriend of Deadpool in the Fox Deadpool films. That's the only one who can really do it, because Copycat can not just copy the physical form of a mutant, she can also copy their powers, right? So she can literally block her existence or anybody that she's copying from like any telepath if she's duplicating a telepath, right? So it's cool, right? She can like copy the powers of Charles Xavier and have some measure of telepathy. But after basically stabbing Storm and seemingly killing her, this basically leads to Mystique body sliding by one out of that location, i.e., teleporting away. And then of course John Ironside runs to the side of Storm, and while she's not dead, of course the goal is to get a medical evac in there so they can get her out of there, get her treatment, and get her healed again. And so at that point we jump to Destiny, and we have Destiny basically here at the World Farm. Now remember, the World Farm is a place out there on the far reaches of the universe, right? At the very edge of the universe. And what we end up finding out is that Destiny, ever the precog and ever aware of what's going on around her and always looking to the horizon, right? That's one of the things about Destiny. While everybody's running around and focusing on the here and now, she's 10 steps ahead almost every single time. That's her gift and her role of being able to see and understand the future. As always, and one of the things I want to mention here, if Destiny tells you something's going to happen in 5 minutes, take it as an absolute truth. If she tells you something's going to happen in 5 years, keep it in the back of your head, because it may not come to fruition. But Destiny is always on the move, and she's always being guided by her visions. It's why the old Destiny Diaries story in the X-Men comics were so important. Those of you guys who remember the Destiny Diaries stories, those were great back in the day. It was really cool. One of the last great X-Men stories before the huge reboot with House of M. But the thing about this is that, of course, Destiny being here at the World Farm, we end up finding out that she's talking to one of the other Sinisters, specifically the one with the spade on his head. And so it's kind of crazy here, because this is basically one of the Sinisters seemingly aware of what the other Sinister is doing, but trying to find a way to bring his campaign to an end. We don't know fully what role he's going to play, or how far reaching his actions are, or if he's just hiding the fact that he wants to do exactly what Sinister did, but wants to see the Diamond Sinister taken out. But whatever the case is, I'm sure we'll find out by the end of this story. What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Sins of Sinister, and in this one, we're covering Nightcrawlers, which is amazing, because the ending of this is gonna be pretty nuts. So, here's the way this works. So, as you guys know, with the Sins of Sinister storyline, that Marvel is basically releasing 3 different comics, essentially, that show us what's going on during this 10-year time period going into the future, when Sinister basically conquers everything. And so what this does is this initially picks up in the Sanctum Sanctorum, right, of Doctor Strange. And what we end up having here is, in effect, Banshee. Now, this is a version of Banshee that we haven't really talked about yet, and in fact, it's a version of his character that has been introduced relatively recently in the Legion of X storyline in the new era of Marvel Comics X-Men stuff. But the idea behind this guy possesses what's called the Spirit of Variance. With Banshee and with the Spirit of Variance, there's not a whole lot that we know here. Because of the fact that the Spirit of Variance was introduced so recently and then immediately thrown into this is going to be one of those instances where we see the capabilities of what the Spirit of Variance can do, and that as time progresses, Marvel will likely build on it. But the Spirit of Variance was at one point a Spirit of Vengeance, and this is one of the big changes that Marvel's making to the nature of Ghost Rider, the Ghost Rider mythos itself, that when it comes to the Spirits of Vengeance, they weren't really a collective of beings that existed out there. That instead, the Spirit of Vengeance was more of a concept. It was the general name given to the dark persona of a Ghost Rider. But the reality here is that how that Ghost Rider gained their powers changed from one Ghost Rider to the next. And so what Marvel's doing here is they're introducing this idea that the Spirits of Vengeance are more like a spiritual collective that exists out there, not that dissimilar from like cosmic entities, but drastically less powerful, seemingly, and that the Spirit of Variance was at one point a Spirit of Vengeance. But unlike the other Spirits of Vengeance, it had effectively kind of changed its ways, decided to go a different route, and was more peaceful in nature as opposed to destructive, and this led to the Spirits of Vengeance effectively casting it out. So again, this may be one of those things where it may not necessarily stand the test of time, which is to say in like 5 years, somebody's gonna get rid of it and you'll never see or hear from the Spirit of Variance again, and it'll kind of go back to just being the traditional Spirit of Vengeance that exists out there. But again, you know, it's just it's a cool little change to see whether or not it sticks with the general audience and whether or not Marvel keeps it. But that's why you see this different variation of Banshee, or this different appearance of Banshee. Now, the cool thing about this is that in the middle of that, while he's here, he's suddenly set upon by what's called the Legion of the Night. And this group is cool. And it's one of the coolest things that I've seen Marvel do in recent years. So one of the things we had talked about in the Sins of Sinister one-shot, which again, you'll find the playlist down in the description if you want to get caught up. We're only 2 videos in, so there really isn't a whole lot of catching up to do there. But one of the things that we have found out is that during this 10-year time period, that Sinister was creating what were basically Chimera, a sort of merger of different mutants and their powers that existed out there. But one of the things we learned beyond that was Sinister sort of taking over and possessing even non-mutant beings that were out there. Spider-Man is an example of this. And so what's in effect happened here is that you have Toad, you have Sabretooth, you have Spider-Man, you've got X-23, Laura Kinney, you have Pyro, you have people here, right? It looks like Pixie, I'm pretty sure, but you have people here who have basically been merged with the powers of Nightcrawler. And what this does is it turns them into Sinister's most deadly assassins. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if Cy Spurrier had taken like X-Men 2, remember like the old Nightcrawler intro from the X-Men 2 film? If that was his motivation for why this was happening, because that scene in that movie made Nightcrawler cooler than I think he'd ever been in the history of Marvel Comics. It was dope to see Nightcrawler as an assassin jumping through the White House and going after the president. So I'm not surprised if this was like a major influence for that. But having characters like X-23 and Spider-Man who have been taken over by the power of Sinister, and their powers have been augmented to basically include the abilities of Nightcrawler where they can teleport around, is cool because they're basically everywhere. Plus, the Legion of the Night is just a dope name. Let's just say it, guys, like it's just ridiculously cool. But one of the funny things about this is that these guys have been on the hunt for Banshee for quite some time. Now, this is when we get this small kind of adjustment to the capabilities of what Banshee can do. That one of the things that happens here is that in this fight, he used what's called the Scream of Change. And this is kind of a differentiation between like the Spirit of Variance and like the Spirit of Vengeance. The Spirit of Vengeance, if we want to go that route and actually accept that as a thing, that it provides its user with something called the Penance Stare. And that's well known in the Marvel community among Ghost Rider fans. For those of you guys who aren't familiar with the Penance Stare, what it does is that when it's used on someone, it forces them to feel the pain of everyone they've ever hurt over the course of their life all at one time. But with a scream of change, what ends up happening is that when it's used on X-23, it actually breaks the hold that Sinister has on X-23. And when that happens, it actually leads to Banshee not just using it on X-23, but using it on everybody else. And it, in essence, liberates them from the control of Sinister. Now, one of the things right off the bat is that we're told this is not some kind of MacGuffin. It's not some kind of thing where all Banshee has to do is just get like a really, really big bullhorn and just shout into the air and whole cities will be liberated from Sinister's control. One of the things we're told here is that they've tried this multiple times on different people who have been taken over by Sinister, and it doesn't work. So for whatever reason, it seemingly works here. So it's really just a way for Spurrier to give us this explanation of how this team can kind of come into existence, but it's not going to be this way across the board unilaterally as far as everyone being possessed by Sinister on Earth. Not only that, what ends up happening here is once this is done, Banshee actually teleports and meets with Mother Righteous. Now again, Mother Righteous was also introduced in Legion of X. One of the reasons why we kind of skipped over the first volume of Legion of X is because it's not very important. It's really just kind of establishing what goes on with Legion himself. You don't really see any like grandiose displays of his power or anything along those lines. It's really just kind of like, here's what Legion and like some other characters are doing like at this point in time. It's a setup story. It's really all it is. Volume 2 is where things get really, really cool. But Volume 1 is by no means essential, at least if you're already familiar with the characters. If you don't know anything about Legion or any of those characters, sure, I guess it's essential to a degree. But the thing about this is that what we find out from Mother Righteous is that she's actually meeting with Orbis Stellaris as well as Dr. Stasis. Now, these are characters that we have talked about before. We covered Orbis Stellaris and Dr. Stasis after we did the Sins of Sinister one-shot. And what we learned is that the Mister Sinister that we've seen all these years in Marvel Comics is just one version of him. That he's more or less a clone of the original Nathaniel Essex. That Dr. Stasis and Orbis Stellaris are the other clones of Sinister, right? So there were like 3 down and 1 to go. We didn't know who the 4th clone was. But as this conversation happens between them, one of the things we find out here is that the Diamond Sinister is kind of operating rogue. The other Sinisters aren't really on board with what he's doing per se. But the reality is, to step into the fray and to somehow become involved, it basically risks them becoming controlled by Sinister. And if that were to happen, there wouldn't really be anybody out there to effectively stand in the way of Sinister. But what Mother Righteous has been doing has actually been working on really manipulating magic and so on and so forth, and trying to find a way to ultimately end these kind of chimera experiments of Sinister, but also working behind the scenes to find the main base of operations for Sinister, where he basically has the Moira McTaggart clones. Now, we talked about that in the last video that we did, where we talked about how Moira McTaggart's power was that every time she died, the timeline was reset. And so Sinister himself is the only one that has possession of the cloning facility, and he has all these different versions of Moira McTaggart, so that if for some reason his experiment goes awry, he can kill one of the Moiras, reset time, but he'll remember everything, right? He'll literally have a kind of database backup that will show him everything that's happened. In his own mind, he won't recall everything, but having it all in a computer system that he can just go back and watch, it basically fills in the gaps for him. So he can continue his experiment from there, becoming aware of what it was that would happen. Like quite literally, Sinister would go to his base of operations and he would say, okay, here's why the whole experiment failed. So now I'm gonna kill one of the Moira McTaggarts. Sinister, when you watch this, you'll understand everything that went wrong and you'll know where to make our corrections. And though he'll just keep doing that and doing that and doing that until he has this kind of perfect timeline where he rules and controls all. So having like Dr. Stasis and having Orbis Stellaris, despite the fact that they are clones of the original Sinister, just like the Sinister with a diamond on his head, they're actively trying to work against him while not being overly obvious about the fact that they're trying to work against him. But the issue of Mother Righteous kind of casting aside some of these spells actually runs in the way of what Dr. Stasis was doing while he was working with Orchis, again, the organization that normally would stand against mutant populations, but at this point is trying to find a way to defeat Sinister. And one of the things he says here is that Orchis commissioned that hex, and while it lasted, Sinister was unable to exploit some of the most dangerous bloodlines. Now he's using the Nightcrawler strain to build his hit squads. So to a degree, while Orchis is not mutant friendly, and Orchis is the organization that exists out there right now trying to bring down the mutant population, the truth about it is that they're standing against Sinister. And before Mother Righteous had gotten involved and kind of destroyed the hex that was used by Orchis that protected these different, really more advanced bloodlines from Sinister's control, people like Nightcrawler, for example, that once she did that, she more or less screwed everything up, right? She more or less kind of torpedoed what Orchis was doing. And that's how we have the Legion of the Night in the first place. And so one of the things that's really picked up on here by Dr. Stasis is that like the accent of Mother Righteous, which judging by the way that it's spelled, or at least pronunciation based on the way that it's spelled, it sounds like, what is it, Cockney English? But one of the things that goes on is that she basically reveals she's the fourth Sinister. Now, if I'm a betting man, to be honest with you guys, I don't think this was the intention of Marvel, which is why I'm not making a great big huge scene out of it. Otherwise it would have been like, and then she takes off her mask and it turns out she's the fourth Sinister. There's a reason why I'm not doing that, because I don't think that was actually supposed to be the case. I think this is what Marvel's doing because of the Sins of Sinister event, but the reality here is that Mother Righteous doesn't have enough history or even enough significance in Marvel Comics for it to actually matter, right? It's one of those things where it's kind of like, I mean, it's cool, I guess, whatever, but it feels more shoehorned in, right? In order to like bolster the popularity of a character that's just not that popular in Marvel. It would have been cooler if it had turned out that like Apocalypse returned and he's like one of the Sinisters or something along those lines, right? By whatever manner and whatever means they want to make that happen. It would have been cool if that was the case, right? Somebody with a long-standing bit of history that under normal circumstances you never would have expected to be a bad guy, but has been manipulating things behind the scenes the whole time. Kind of like a Marvel, or I'm sorry, a mutant version of like Captain America during Secret Empire, right? But once this move is made and once these other Sinisters realize that Mother Righteous is basically trying to take them out because she is in effect a good guy, she's trying to eliminate all the different versions of Sinister and just sort of go from there, you end up having Dr. Stasis that makes his move while Orbis Stellaris watches all of it unfold. And where he does recall, or at least use some of his own forces to try to take them out, that's when you end up having the Legion of the Night, who are now liberated and operating under Mother Righteous, who show up and immediately attack Dr. Stasis. And so this guy ultimately ends up just going the way of the dodo, right? That's quite literally it. And it's done in one of the coolest ways ever, because X-23 with the Nightcrawler abilities, she has a claw that comes out of her tail. And this is one of those things, I didn't know I needed this until I saw it. This is dope, and I'm really hoping this version of X-23 somehow survives the whole Sins of Sinister timeline and ends up in the main Marvel universe. Because I gotta tell you guys, man, X-23 Laura Kinney with the powers of Nightcrawler and like an adamantium claw in her tail, that's pretty badass, and I'm really hoping that this stays. I really do. And so following the defeat of Dr. Stasis, basically Mother Righteous has this kind of conversation with Orbis Stellaris where he literally reveals, I'm the one who stole the cloning facility of Sinister, and I have it in the world form. It's a nigh impregnable place. You can't simply just go in there. So if you kill me, you'll never be able to access the cloning facility of Sinister. It'll be gone forever, right? It'll literally disappear for all time, and we'll be stuck in this timeline. So either you can stay out of my way and I'll give you safe passage through my realm if that's what you need, or you can try to attack me, possibly even kill me, and then we're trapped in this reality until whenever this timeline comes to a conclusion. And so Mother Righteous ultimately lets him go, which is really the smartest move to make. More so than that, what she also intends to do is to bolster her forces. And so the intention of really just the Legion of the Night alongside Banshee being there is one part to try to find a way to bolster their forces by freeing other individuals, whether it's because this kind of freed Legion of the Night wakes other people up, or because it's the powers of the Spirit of Variance waking other people up, much like he woke up the Legion of the Night. Ultimately, it doesn't necessarily work. Of course, it is a bit of a heist to a degree where they're looking to steal, particular things. They do end up stealing a magical book, which is not the Darkhold per se, but it is a book that allows Mother Righteous to manipulate spells to a degree. But the bigger part of this is they have to find a way to see if they can get into the world form. And so using a kind of magical enchantment along with the Spider-Man Nightcrawler merger that basically is willing to sacrifice his life because of the fact that for some reason that's not fully explained, those individuals who are not mutants but are possessed by Sinister, they can't stay freed for too long. That the powers of Banshee only work for so long and then they'll eventually wear off, and Spider-Man would ultimately fall back under the control of Sinister. And in fact, he says as much, right? I can feel those forces, I can feel the voice of Sinister creeping back in again. It's only a matter of time before I succumb to his control, and then I ultimately try to kill all of you guys, which for the most part, Spider-Man with the powers of Nightcrawler could. He's the perfect assassin. But with Peter Parker sacrificing his life, and with the team now consisting of people like Colossus, as well as looks like a younger Pixie, maybe Magic, it's kind of weird, kind of hard to tell, but with the team's roster being bolstered by like one or two people, that Peter's life is sacrificed when he literally tries to teleport into the world form and ultimately perishes in the conflict, right? Perishes during that time because he can't necessarily break through. But what Mother Righteous Righteous realizes is that the force field is not impregnable, that given the right level of power, it can be broken through. And so what she does is she sends the rest of the team on what is in effect a kind of scavenger hunt, right? To basically steal various magical artifacts that exist out there. These magical artifacts consist of things like the Darkhold, right? That looks like the Siege Perilous. I'm not 100% sure if it is. If I remember correctly, it is. The Hammer of Thor, the Eye of Agamotto of Doctor Strange, and for those who were eagle-eyed enough, one of the helmets of the Black Priest from Jonathan Hickman's Avengers and New Avengers run, right? The ability to manipulate magical words. It's like the Black Priests were insanely powerful. They were able to like wipe out whole worlds and different things like that and destroy entire groups of Avengers in one fell swoop. It was nuts. But this is basically some of the most powerful magical artifacts in existence across all of Marvel Comics that are being used and being brought together by Mother Righteous for the purpose of taking down the World Farm. These are powers that in some ways rival the abilities of cosmic entities. So Storm goes beyond Omega level and becomes one of the most powerful mutants to ever exist in the history of Marvel Comics, and it's nuts. Check this out. So this takes place during Sins of Sinister, but unlike the other videos that we did that took place 10 years after Sinister had basically conquered the world, took over the mutant population, took over the Avengers, the whole 9 yards, this takes place 100 years later. So things have changed drastically since the last videos that we covered, and not in a very good way. So this initially picks up with Marvel Boy, also known as Novar. A little bit of history here. This version of Marvel Boy was introduced back in 2000 in his own solo series. He's okay. I mean, in my personal opinion, I think it was just an attempt by Marvel Comics to take a Kree warrior from an alternate reality, give him like insect DNA, and kind of make him like a blend between like the Kree and Spider-Man. It was cool. Marvel Boy does not suck. He's fun to read, but that's just kind of my perception on the character. The important thing here is that he's much, much older. Now, as a lot of you guys are probably wondering, with this being 100 years in the future, why aren't these people as old or even dead like they should be? One of the things to remember is that when it came to the X-Men on Krakoa, they had a lot of technologies that came from the island that allowed them to basically violate death. Either it was resurrection, pills that prolonged their life. So there's a lot of under the current stuff that was already established that's just kind of being rolled over into this, and not a lot of explanation is being given, which I think is a bad thing, because I think there are people who are unfamiliar with the X-Men that are jumping on to Sins of Sinister, and because it's kind of an isolated, self-contained story, it can cause problems. But what ends up going on is, of course, once they get to the ship, and they basically not only give the access code for this round, but the one that actually comes the following week, that's when it's revealed they're actually meeting with Destiny, or at least Destiny's on the ship, and she's being brought to meet with Storm. Now, there's history here, and we'll go over that over the course of this video. We'll make it all make sense. But Destiny showing up here, things have gotten bleak for her, because one of the things to know is that, yes, while Destiny is a precognitive, meaning she can see the future, one of the things we've always talked about is that her ability to decipher what's going to happen is relative to how far in the future she's looking. If she tells you something's going to happen in 100 years, take it with a grain of salt, because a lot can happen between now and 100 years from now. But if she says something's going to happen in 5 minutes, take it as an absolute truth. The thing about this is that she oftentimes uses her own abilities to see the future to kind of work for herself, right? To ensure her own schemes and motivations are satisfied first. Then she worries about everybody else second. So she's like the most American person ever. So the thing here is that once she arrives, a lot of people have aged up, right? For example, Cable is older than he was before, and in fact, even his technology has changed. Now, the reason why I say that is that for those of you guys who are unfamiliar with Cable, we are not going to go into the origin of his character, because I made a 35-minute video on that, and even then I was cramming stuff in. You'll find a link to that video pinned as a comment if you're interested. But Cable is one half human and one half machine, but the techno-organic virus was always like eating away at his body. What's going on here is that he's now merged with a kind of organic technology, so it's more of a symbiosis as opposed to a parasitic infection. But for Destiny herself, what we end up finding out is that somewhere along the line, Mystique left her, right? Mystique left to go pursue her own destiny, in the sense that she wanted to help the rebel forces try to defeat Sinister and his forces. The X-Men, the Avengers, the surviving superheroes, basically. Anybody who was under the influence of Sinister. What's so cool about this is that when she did it, she reunited Freedom Force. And as soon as I saw that, I was like, Freedom Force? No way! She's literally like, on your feet, Freedom Force, for the rebellion. And I was like, bro, like Freedom Force hasn't been a thing in Marvel Comics for decades. Unless I'm missing something, Freedom Force hasn't been a thing for years. The important thing here, Freedom Force was basically Mystique's Brotherhood of Evil Mutants reworked into a superhero team and working for the Commission on Superhuman Activity, specifically Valerie Cooper. That all happened during Chris Claremont's run back in the 1980s in the X-Men, but Freedom Force was amazing back then. I loved them. It was one of the coolest ideas ever. But basically Mystique's dead, right? She ended up dying for the cause. And so once Destiny finally gets before Storm, Storm's a lot older than she used to be, but do not let her fool you, man. She is every bit as powerful as she used to be, and actually more so. Like, it's nuts how capable she is. But one of the things Destiny says is that with the death of Mystique, it's now changed the landscape, because where a lot of her machinations and seeing the future and kind of manipulating pieces and so on were to ensure the survival of herself and Mystique, that they could have some measure of a happy life together, the reality is that now things are different, right? With Mystique being gone and out of the picture, now Destiny's focusing on the bigger picture itself. How do we find a way to end the rule of Sinister? Now, one of the things to remember here is that there are a handful of Sinisters running around right now. Back in the day in Marvel, there was only one, but what we've learned is there's actually four. You have Mother Righteous, you have Orbis Stellaris, you've got the main Sinister with the diamond on his head, and then you've got Dr. Stasis, right? So one of the things to understand is that with Sins of Sinister, this story focuses on the influence and the control of the diamond-headed Sinister, right? The original Sinister, quote unquote, if you want to call him that. But again, what goes on here is that a coming together of Storm's forces alongside Destiny launch an attack against Orbis Stellaris, just one of the Sinisters that are out there. It makes the most logical sense because the stories of Storm focus more on space than anything else, but taking out each one of the Sinisters in turn would ultimately allow them to focus all their efforts on the main Sinister. Now, one of the other things to remember that we covered in the first video is that you had Moira McTaggart, that her mutant power was that every time she died, the timeline reset. And so what ended up happening is that in order to prevent that from happening, or at least Sinister resetting the timeline and restarting his experiment, that the original attack of Storm and her forces was capturing the Moira McTaggart clones, which basically prevented Sinister from resetting everything. So that's why this universe has just continued on the way that it has, as opposed to being reset and changed somewhere along the lines. And so what this does is this transitions to Storm and her team arriving at the Death Sphere. Now the Death Sphere, which kind of looks like a Death Star, is pretty awesome. This is the result of the work of Orbis Stellaris over the course of 100 years, where this guy was originally just a Sinister that was out there, that by using the progenitors, which are some pretty murky concepts in Marvel kind of teases the idea that they predate the Celestials, maybe they were created by the Celestials, maybe they created the Celestials. It's just one of those inconsistent things that's been going on ever since their appearance in the Royals comics back in the day. But the point is that with these progenitors and the level of power that they possess, that in a lot of ways, Orbis Stellaris and the progenitors have been working together. That what Orbis Stellaris wanted to do was use the power of the progenitors to actually conquer the entirety of the universe. Now, of course, this runs in direct defiance with the diamond-headed Sinister, who's starting on Earth, conquering the entirety of the superhero community and spreading himself outward. But ultimately, it would all come to a head with these guys most likely waging war against each other. Such as it is, that's actually not what's going to happen here. Instead, one of the things to remember is that in the last video that we covered, that when it came to the Moira McTaggarts, which is to say, again, Moira's ability to basically die and then reset the timeline, that what had happened is that where the effort was made by Storm and her team to basically take all the Moira McTaggarts and then remove them from Sinister with the diamond on his head so he couldn't reset the timeline and then start all over again, the Moiras in turn were taken from Storm and then brought to Orbis Stellaris by Destiny herself, who again was manipulating everything behind the scenes. But with Orbis Stellaris having the Moiras at his disposal, the nature of this plan that they have that was formed under Destiny is really ingenious. That what's actually happened here, and for those of you guys who are familiar with Star Wars, this will be very reminiscent of battle meditation, that what had actually happened here is that Korra, who has the ability to amplify the powers of anybody around her, had amplified the abilities of Destiny, basically moving her precognitive abilities to a more fine-tuned point where she could actually tell exactly what's going to happen moments before it happens. The reason why this is so important is that alongside Cable's telepathy, what it does is it allows Destiny to predict exactly what the ships of Orbis Solaris are going to do, and then to navigate through them and to get around them. So this is why I say it's very much a battle meditation kind of thing. But this is all important because of the fact that when Storm's team arrives here, what ends up happening is Orbis Stellaris, most likely in a state of hubris, ends up seeing the kind of ragtag band of Storm. He views it more as a kind of last ride of Storm and the Brotherhood. They intend to die, right? Prepare for ramming speed, that kind of a thing. And so he sends out all of his forces. But with Destiny at their disposal and being able to move in between all these ships, a way out is a way in. And the reason why I say that is because the forces of Storm actually end up moving past all the vessels and then fly into the exact docking bay that the ships are using to get out of the Death Sphere in the first place. But once the doors shut, there's nobody there to protect the inside of the sphere, which in a lot of ways gives Storm and her forces free reign. But it's a really smart maneuver here, because when that happens, what we end up finding out is that in the initial conversation between Storm and Destiny, that with Mystique out of the picture, what Destiny wanted to do was basically wipe out all the Moras, right? Kill one or all of them, reset the timeline, and take everything back to the way it was supposed to be. The fact that her and Mystique could continue to live some measure of a life is the only reason she hadn't done it, but the actions of Destiny is actually what led to the deaths of Storm's original Brotherhood team in the first place. So Storm does continue to hold on to a vendetta, and this comes to a head when Storm decides to betray the plan and then orders Korra to kill Destiny on the spot. Now, whether or not Destiny saw this coming or even potentially realized it was just the end result of her fate, this is where she died, and that was basically it, we don't necessarily know. But what we do know is that with Destiny killed, the rest of the team doesn't really understand what's going on here. And even Marvel Boy asked the question, he's like, I don't get it. We got here and then we're not blowing up the Moras? Like, this is the whole reason we came on this mission, to blow up the Moras, reset the timeline, and set everything back to normal. But the response of Storm is that yes, this place is hell, but a hell that still supports life and thus supports hope, which seems like a nonsensical statement, right? Like, yes, we have the opportunity to destroy all the Moras and reset the timeline, but if we keep them alive, this horrible universe continues on, and the people in it have hope that things can get better. It's like, but I mean, you can make them better right now by wiping out the timeline. So I mean, you know, like, just wipe out the timeline. Like, it's one of those things that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. So I submit that yes, Storm has become a lot more powerful, but in her old age, she's also going senile, and that's why she makes the decision that she makes. It's the only way to make it make sense. But then she also starts to realize that, again, inside the core of the Death Sphere are the progenitors, and that they are astronomically powerful. The only reason they allied themselves with Orbis Stellaris is because they had a mutual goal. But once the progenitors realized that Storm and her Brotherhood are here, and that they would most likely end up destroying the combined experiment of the progenitors and Orbis Stellaris, they would manifest, they would step in, and then Storm and her forces wouldn't stand a chance. And so in order to ensure that doesn't happen, and this is why I say Storm's level of power just absolutely skyrockets, that in order to ensure that doesn't happen, that Korra, under the direction of Storm, amplifies Storm's powers even further, right? Her ability to control the weather is all amplified. And then in turn, Storm taps into the magics of her ancestors and then rips open a black hole. And when that happens, it pulls the progenitors and even the core of the world farm through, right? The world farm is where they're basically experimenting and all that kind of stuff. Now, the progenitors do end up basically leaving and focusing on their own individual worlds. But lest we forget, the idea of Storm opening up a gravity well in space, that's astronomical, because what you're now talking about here is reality warping, right? She's a low-level reality warper, but she's manipulating matter on the atomic level. And this is why I say, when you're talking about Omega-level mutants, even Storm herself directly addressing this, right? To be Omega-level means to be without limits, that in effect, every Omega-level mutant has a level of power that in some capacity allows them to manipulate the structure of matter. That's why there's no limit to their abilities, right? Somebody with high-level telekinesis can manipulate matter. Somebody who has low-level telekinesis can manipulate matter. They move objects around, but a person who practices that telekinesis long enough, specifically if they're an Omega level mutant with no upper limit, then it's only a matter of time before moving a chair around a room turns into moving molecules around and restructuring matter. And that's exactly what Storm just did. She used her power to manipulate weather, which is in and of itself manipulating molecules, even if it only affects weather in a localized space. And she's expanded this out to now controlling the atomic structure or the molecular structure of matter within a localized space. Again, she's not Franklin Richards level, but the ability to alter matter in a localized space is massive. But here's one of the beautiful things about this, or tragic if you want to consider it that. With Orbis Stellaris realizing that the jig is up, right? This is a losing game. There's no way for him to come out on top anymore, that it's all basically over, that he shuts down life support within the system itself. It basically kills everybody inside the ship outside of Storm and her forces, but with Storm exerting so much power at one time, she can't survive the experience, and Storm dies. And so this is amazing, because literally she goes out with a bang. And so in turn, her Brotherhood seizes control of the ship of Orbis Stellaris, and then most likely starts using it as a beachhead, and they're continuing war against the forces of the Sinisters that are trying to manipulate and conquer the entirety of the Marvel Universe. What's going on, Rob? This is Guys, and we are back with Nightcrawler. So this opens in one of the coolest ways ever, right? The Sons of Sinister story is phenomenal. So what we end up finding out here is that where the Nightcrawlers were originally introduced to us as what were, by all standards of measurement, kind of like the assassins of the original Mister Sinister, Nathaniel Essex, that in the first video that we did, we found that over time, the Nightcrawlers started to break away from his influence. And so what ended up happening is that defecting from Mister Sinister, they started allying themselves with Mother Righteous, who was another clone of Sinister that existed out there. Now, by and large, she had just kind of been hands-off. She was watching everything unfold. The original Quiet Council, so the original leaders of the X-Men, who were influenced by the Diamond Sinister's power, ultimately defecting, taking over from him, and then kind of launching a conquest of the universe. That one of the things that we find is that over time, while that was happening, right, that when the first video took place 10 years later, this one taking place 100 years later, that in that 90-year window, the universe has become a very dark place. The forces of magic, who have basically, again, broke away from control of Sinister, has been launching a conquest and in fact tried to bring the magical realm or the demonic realm of Limbo into the main Marvel universe and didn't succeed, right? That one of the things Xavier did as the really like the villainous version of himself, he traveled to the Shi'ar Empire, right, their home world, and used his telepathy to convince them that everybody was out to get them, and basically drove the Shi'ar Empire into a state of civil war where they all started killing each other, right? You have the forces of Asgard, which are always at war with any other race that's out there because it's trying to remain in isolation, that there's a point where Otherworld, right, so King Arthur and all those guys, that empire basically starts to crumble and fall due to no protection coming from the X-Men or anything. The universe as a whole is quite literally completely and totally falling apart. And it's really interesting to see that because the X-Men went from being heroes to being villains, that they've led to this full-scale conquest and collapse of reality as we know it in terms of any real organizational structure across the universe as a whole. It's a very dark and bleak place, but through all of that, what the Nightcrawlers have been doing in the service of Mother Righteous is they've been kind of hopping and skipping through these different events and stealing particular artifacts, right? Stealing small little things. In the midst of this giant battle between like Loki and the Asgardians and whatever force happens to be out there, the Nightcrawlers teleport in, steal an artifact, and then teleport out. And so what it does is it focuses on Asgard proper, that what they're doing is they're hunting for an artifact. Specifically, they're hunting for the hammer of Thor, and that when they get there, Thor immediately turns on them and then tries to attack them. But understand, the Nightcrawlers, at least Kurt Wagner by himself, just a guy, is probably the most prodigious assassin that Marvel Comics has, but you never see him operate in that way. But what ends up happening is that because you have Laura Kinney X-23, who was basically merged with the Nightcrawler gene, it's effectively a version of Wolverine who can teleport like Nightcrawler. She still has the adamantium claws, so she overcomes Thor like that. I mean, in the blink of an eye, slices his arm off, and that's basically it. Now, because they can't actively lift his hammer, what they end up doing is they end up having one of the other members of what are called the Nightkin, basically a different name for the Nightcrawlers, that what they do is they use their ability to manipulate gravity to control where the hammer goes. Now, that's not uncommon, and in fact, that's been a thing in Marvel Comics for years. Ever since Magneto first fought the Avengers, we've seen people who have been able to use the fundamental properties of the electromagnetic spectrum spectrum or gravity or what have you to manipulate the hammer of Thor. But what we end up doing is transitioning over to Vox Ignis, who again is basically Sean Cassidy, Banshee, with the power of kind of a Ghost Rider, basically by all standards of measurement. It has a different name and a history, but it is in effect one of the Ghost Rider spirits that ended up becoming a good guy. But the important thing here is that it is Banshee with an immense level of power, but he doesn't really do a whole lot here, so it's not overly important to understand his character. What he does do is he goes and he talks to Laura Kinney, and what she says is that her former husband basically is undergoing what's called the last rite, right? That's Summer Night, which is what he's called. She says he's losing his battle against the Diamond. Sinister is retaking control. A great trauma can have that effect. Now, here's why that matters, because one of the things we learned is that when Sinister created the Nightcrawlers, that he intentionally bred infertility into them, meaning that they cannot procreate, or they should not be able to. But much like the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And what ended up happening is Laura Kinney, X-23, and the Nightcrawler Cyclops ended up having a baby. The problem is the baby suddenly teleported out, right? It literally just disappeared, seemingly out of nowhere. And what it looked like is that its powers manifested at birth and teleported away. But the kicker to this is that while Laura seemed to be able to get past it, or at the very least was kind of like, you know, I've endured pain and torment and trauma before, that Nightcrawler Cyclops was not able to do the same and has effectively just become a drunk, right? His pain in losing his child has just gotten the worst of him. And so the result of this is he undertakes what's called the last rite, in the sense that it's ritualistic suicide. And what happens is that he literally teleports to essentially the force field that surrounds all the Moira McTaggarts in the hopes that like his sacrifice will bring the force field down. Now there's something that I want you to keep in the back of your head. One, because we're kind of doing this in segments, right? So instead of doing it issue by issue in order, we're doing the Nightcrawlers, then Immortal X-Men or Immoral X-Men, and so on and so forth. So based on the videos we've run, it might be a smidge out of order here, but that whole ritualistic sacrifice is something that I want you to keep in mind, because one of the things that happens is that Sean Cassidy, and having this conversation with Laura Kinney, she starts asking these questions, right? She says, we're running low on the flesh of Cortez to extend our leaps, because people who are familiar with the X-Men know Fabian Cortez is a mutant that has the ability to amplify the powers of mutants around him. And so with the inability to clone mutants the same way Sinister was, that the ability to use the abilities of Fabian Cortez are running low. So they won't be able to teleport as far as long as things stay on this current course. The other part of that is that without the ability to procreate, and with the Nightcrawlers teleporting in ritualistic suicide due to this last rite, basically the ending of their lives, their numbers are running low. In essence, the Nightcrawlers are basically going extinct. And so if for no other reason than for self-preservation, you have Laura Kinney who says, you need to go ask a question to Mother Righteous in order for us to get a definitive answer. And what Sean Cassidy says, and this is something that's really important too, is he says he does talk to Mother Righteous, but she always approaches people and always asks the same question: if you could do things over, what would you have done differently? Now, one of the instances where she asked this question is to Legion. Now remember, Legion is an Omega level mutant. I mean, this guy's got thousands of personalities, each one with a power of its own, but he also has the ability to alter reality. Now within the Legion of X comic books, where the Mother Righteous was initially introduced, one of the things that Legion had done is he had basically created a pocket universe where he could bring the spiritual essence of different mutants in, and they could live a life or live some measure of escape from the reality of the world that they lived in. What he's done here is that continuing this dimensional realm, this pocket universe he created, that he literally brought the X-Men that he could save to this place. So they left their physical bodies behind, and their spiritual essence remains here, but it seems to kind of be the larger part of Legion himself. He kind of absorbed them into himself. And as he's talking to Mother Righteous, what he effectively says is, if I could do it all over again, I never would have trusted you. I never would have believed you. I never would have let you get your clutches and introduced you to the X-Men the way that I did. Such as it is, there's only one thing that I can do, and it's to simply leave to a higher plane of existence. Now, the crazy thing about this is that where X-23 is hearing this story, she initially sees the original Legion as a person that could save them, and he could. Given the level of power that he has at his disposal, he could fix everything in an instant, but he's become disillusioned with the entirety of not just the mutant population, but the universe as a whole. Why save a place that you believe simply just deserves to die, that you don't care about anymore? And so he ultimately takes off. We don't know where he goes to, and we ultimately never find out. The important thing here is that X-23 has Sean Cassidy talk to Mother Righteous for the purpose of allowing the Nightcrawlers to go on a mission. And what they end up doing is they basically teleport back to Earth, which has now just become this really dark and crappy place that's just been run amok with all the experiments of Sinister that are constantly evolving and constantly changing, all albeit without any real measure of sentience of their own, and they in turn get to the Xavier Institute, right, the place where the X-Men used to reside, and they find Dr. Nemesis there. Now, Dr. Nemesis, under normal circumstances, right, James Bradley, he's just a guy that has an incredible level of intelligence, but due to the experimentation of Sinister over time, he's basically kind of infused with what is in effect fungal matter. And what this has done is allowed him to expand this fungal matter across the entirety of the world, and has also expanded his intelligence to go along with it. So he's like this just astronomically genius being, more so than he ever was before. But the reason for the X-Men being there, or at least the Nightcrawlers being there, is because once they teleport back, the kind of situation they present to Mother Righteous is that using the intelligence of Dr. Nemesis, they can find some way to start cloning more Nightcrawlers and continue the propagation and the existence of their race. Now, something to understand here is X-23 making this declaration and presenting this entire scenario to Mother Righteous, it was effectively a ruse. She basically went on the mission with ulterior motives. There was the public motive she gave, which is, we need to find a way so that the Nightcrawlers can continue to exist so we can continue serving you, right? You know, in an honorable fashion as our religious leader and so on and so forth. The reality here is she teleported down to Earth so she could grab the original Nightcrawler who's long since been mutated and has just kind of run its evolutionary course so that he can show up here and kill Mother Righteous. And the reason why is because what Mother Righteous does from a religious perspective, and we'll talk more about this here in a second, because I feel like the religious motivations of her character are a lot more clear in the third issue than the second issue. But when she kind of pitched herself as this religious leader, she kept talking about the spark, right? The spark of the mutant population and so on and so forth. But the reason why I say this is that the spark, as it was originally introduced in Marvel Comics, was a concept by Nightcrawler that was a colloquial term for faith, right? Keep the spark alive, keep the faith alive, right? Keep the belief alive, that kind of a thing, right? It was kind of a way to say, like, we're the ones who keep the faith strong, we're the heroes, we do the good thing, that kind of a situation. What Mother Righteous has done here is corrupt it and basically use it for her own ends. The spark is you doing whatever it is that I tell you to do because I'm your religious leader. That's basically what she's done. And so when the original Nightcrawler shows up here, he's angry at her because of the fact that she has basically perverted what the spark is supposed to represent. But Mother Righteous, in no uncertain terms, kills this guy on the spot, right? Literally wipes him out. And he's referred to as the apostate, right? The guy who defied the will of Mother Righteous, tried to kill the religious leader. And so with the death of Nightcrawler, X-23 tries to jump in, and then in turn, Mother Righteous snaps her fingers and then submits X-23 to just an astronomical amount of mental pain. But that turns out to be the nail in the coffin for Mother Righteous. And it happens in two different ways. The first is because she tells the other Nightkin to basically wrap up the apostate and then send him toward his own doom, right? To experience the last rite, which is basically teleporting him into the force field surrounding the Moira McTaggarts in the hopes that they can basically break through. The other reason why this is a big deal is because in the moment when X-23 is being tortured by Mother Righteous, what happens is she gets a glimpse of the daughter that she believed to have been dead, only to find out that Mother Righteous is actually holding her prisoner. But we also get this insane moment, right? Because with issue number 3, we jump forward 1,000 years. And what we end up finding out here is somewhere along the line, and we don't know how this happened, and we're not given any explanation as to how it happened, Absalom Mercator had basically merged or somehow become a combination person with the Silver Surfer. Now, the Silver Surfer, most all of you guys know who that is, but Mr. M is an Omega level mutant with the power to warp reality. So it would be like if Franklin Richards and the Silver Surfer merged, right? Just a crazy level of power. So much so that what the Silver Mercator was doing was traveling around the universe and unstitching the Lokis from reality, literally wiping them from existence, removing them from the universe. Now, this has happened in a variety of ways and among a variety of different people. Different Sinisters were overcome by the Brood Horde, which are basically the Marvel Comics version of the Aliens, right? The Xenomorph movie, that kind of thing, Sigourney Weaver and all that. It's their version of that, more or less, right? The two kind of run hand in hand. But Mother Righteous herself still continues on with this idea of trying to find a way to attain what's called the Reliquary Perilous, as well as breaking through the force field of the Moira McTaggarts. Now, this is where all this stuff we've been talking about starts to get cleared up. So Mother Righteous, with regards to her religious convictions, positions herself as the religious leader of the Nightcrawlers, but the reality is she doesn't care anything about them. She sees them as a means to an end. But what she learned over the course of her time is nothing will convince people to do something like religious faith, right? It's like that line from the Book of Eli when Gary Oldman's character is talking about the nature of the Bible, and he says it's a tool to control the weak and the desperate. And that's how Mother Righteous uses religion here, that you have all these Nightcrawlers who have just have these grotesque physical appearances because without the ability to clone the original Nightcrawler, they're making clones out of clones out of clones, right? So you have Laura Kinney, who is a clone of Nightcrawler, or kind of a chimera of Nightcrawler. They clone Laura Kinney, which has her own set of problems, but they clone that clone and they clone that clone, so on and so forth. So you run into this situation where you have these grotesque and mutated versions of Nightcrawler, but it doesn't matter to her because the only real purpose they serve is to basically commit ritualistic suicide. That whenever one of them show up here and they say, "Mother, I have to apologize. I've heard talk of the apostate and like the false prophet," right? So Nightcrawler, the original Nightcrawler that tried to kill Mother Righteous, and the false prophet, basically X-23, who tried to kill Mother Righteous, that whenever they hear talk about this and they tell Mother Righteous about that, in order to remove anybody that may even begin to harbor the idea that she's not telling the truth, she basically uses the religious conviction through words and saying, "It's okay, my child, take the last rite and you will be forgiven of your sins," and they teleport themselves to suicide. It's pretty dark, man. It's really, really dark. It's a horrible thing to do. And what's so crazy about this is, again, she doesn't believe anything she's saying. She's doing it, one part, because it gains her power, and two, just because she can, right? She's doing it for no other reason than the fact that she can. And it basically creates willful servants that are just too naive to ask any questions of her, right? By seeding out and removing any measure of dissent, that now she has this almost kind of group of people that follow her with, no pun intended, a religious fervor. And so in the midst of this conversation, or where she sends this Nightcrawler off to die, again, she has what's called a phoenix egg, which can potentially harbor, allow for the birth of a phoenix, the phoenix returning to a particular host. Again, this all kind of goes into the reliquary perilous, so you're not going to see anything crazy, which we will explain what the perilous is. But she's talked to by Dr. Nemesis, who has long since left Earth, but become this giant fungal organism. But what he's done is he's taken his ability to control fungal organisms, and now he's able to see and hear everything across the universe. And what he tells her is that the original Mister Sinister has basically resurfaced. Now, we know this just by virtue of the events that have transpired in the Immoral X-Men comic, which is really, really cool. If you guys haven't seen our video on that, you'll find a link to it down in the comments section. But what Mother Righteous says here is that she's largely been hands-off. She's been focusing on her own little scheme over here. And the Diamond X-Men and all the other X-Men out there have been waging war against each other, trying to conquer the universe and so on and so forth. And she started to realize there's a much bigger event at play here, and it all comes down to destiny. Now, that's been a common theme that we've talked about in the Sins of Sinister story. The destiny is a precognitive. She can see the future. If she tells you something's going to happen in 500 years, take it with a grain of salt. If she tells you something's going to happen in 5 minutes, take it as an absolute truth. And so she kind of touches on some of the events that have transpired over time. That Mystique ultimately ended up dying, that the entire motivation behind Destiny doing everything she did in this universe was to try to find some measure of a life with Mystique. But the reality here is that because Mystique felt like she was caged, it was only a matter of time before she went out to fight the oppressors and was ultimately killed. But with the death of Mystique, her being the wife of Destiny, the response of Destiny is, then we simply reset the timeline, and that's basically it, right? Now that my love interest is gone and there's nothing here for me anymore, now we do the right thing. We set the universe back to the way that it's supposed to be by killing one of the Mara clones. But of course, as we know from the Storm and the Brotherhood of Mutants storyline, she was killed, right? She was literally cut in half at the direction of Storm herself, right? This desire to keep this universe going, to keep this universe alive. And so what ends up happening here is Mother Righteous is told by Dr. Nemesis there is an object that is heading towards the Mora McTaggarts, right? This impenetrable force field that nobody seems to be able to access. And when Mother Righteous realizes what it is, she realizes this was set in motion by Destiny thousands of years ago, like 1,000 years ago, when the Sins of Sinister story first kicked off. And so what she does is she brings together all the Nightcrawlers. She has the trumpets sounded. They all teleport into the impenetrable force field and they're all killed, right? They're all eradicated. And so the only other thing that she does is she basically brings in what's called Auntie Fortune. Now, Auntie Fortune was at the beginning of Sins of Sinister, a Nightcrawler that had been merged with Domino. And as those of you guys who are familiar with Domino from Marvel Comics know, she has the ability to bend luck in her favor. And this is the reason why Mother Righteous always has the brain of Auntie Fortune around her, because no matter what happens, things will always happen to fall in her favor. Luck will always be on her side. And her being here is no different, because what happens is that in watching all of this transpire, you suddenly have a Ghost Rider imbued Galactus who arrives on the scene. And it's amazing to see. Because when that happens, right, Banshee shows up and says like, yes, somewhere along the line, we don't know how it happened, and honestly, we never find out how it happened. All the different spirits of vengeance that had escaped Earth at the rise of the forces of Sinister bonded themselves to Galactus. Now, all of this seems to be predicated on the fact that Galactus, being a being of hunger, was hunger for vengeance against the mutant population for everything they had done to the universe. But whatever the motivation is, it's a being traveling around the universe with the powers of the Ghost Rider, wiping out everything in his path. And so where you do have Sean Cassidy that says, we have to step in and do something, the response of Mother Righteous is no. She says, 1,000 years ago, the Sinisters shot an unstoppable object right through the brain of a Titan. They didn't stop to wonder where it would go next, but Destiny did. Destiny knew. Now, if you guys remember, at the very beginnings of the Sins of Sinister story, the first one shot that we got, that you had the island of Krakoa that literally had a giant tree that the mutant population could talk to. What ended up happening is that in an effort to lobotomize the Krakoan island and take away its control, allowing the X-Men free reign to operate as they wanted to under the influence of Sinister, they shot the Juggernaut through its head. And what she says is a millennium of gravity wells, slingshots, infinitesimal changes, of course, building speed, becoming light in time, screaming in the silence of the vacuum, unable to die, unable to stop, madder than a box of otters, while she tweaked the path of the World Farm, setting up a cosmic trick shot, an impossible conjunction. Enter the Juggernaut, and the Juggernaut smashes through the head of Galactus, like bam! Now, this is the cool thing about this. Destiny set all this in motion. She set everything in motion, and this is why I say, this is why Destiny is such a cool character, because 1,000 years ago, Destiny looked at what was gonna happen in the future and said, okay, the X-Men are most likely gonna do this is most likely what's gonna happen, that's most likely what's gonna happen, so in order to ensure everything transpires the way it's supposed to, I will do this, and this, and move these pieces around in this way, so that at the right time, the Juggernaut, as he was shot into space by the X-Men, would ultimately smash through the head of Galactus, and in doing so, puncture a hole through the impenetrable force field of the Moira McTaggarts, right? The right place at the right time. That's how capable of a precognitive Destiny is. And so the result of this is that with the Moira McTaggart force field basically being blown wide open, it allows Mother Righteous to enter with the Reliquary Perilous. Now, here's the funny thing about the Reliquary Perilous, that the way she pitched it to the Nightcrawlers, the way she built it to the Nightcrawlers, it's an artifact of unimaginable power. It's the thing in which we worship, and it's a thing that we value. That's never what it was. She was using it as a tool against the Nightcrawlers in order to gain their faithful service. The nature of the Reliquary Perilous is that it's a time capsule, that when she went around and she was asking all these people, if you could change anything, what would you change? She would take their answers and she would confine it in the Reliquary Perilous. She knows it's only a matter of time before somebody resets the entirety of the universe by killing one of the Moiras. Remember, the power of Moira McTaggart is every time she dies, the universe resets. Now, the goal of Mother Righteous was to grab all these different artifacts, all these different bits of power, how these different things work, where to gain these little pieces of power, right? To even take things like the Phoenix Egg and so on, confine it into what's basically a time capsule and send it back through the time stream, and then kill one of the Moiras herself and reset reality, so that when the time came, because Mother Righteous is a clone of Sinister, and because she was around 200 years before the events of Sins of Sinister ever took place, that what she would be able to do is she could send the artifact to herself, and then she would gain an astronomical amount of power, and she'd be able to basically conquer existence. She could make the universe whatever she wanted it to be, using the power of the Phoenix Egg, so on and so forth, making herself a host for the Phoenix Force, with the power of Thor, all that kind of cool stuff. But of course, what ends up happening here is that with Banshee realizing the goal of Mother Righteous was never to try to find a way to preserve the entirety of this universe, but to actually kidnap the child of X-23 so it can be used for, really even raised for Mother Righteous' own ends in the distant past, to basically send all that back and effectively wipe out the universe. That Banshee has the same motivation that Storm did in Storm of the Brotherhood, where she basically made this argument in saying that yes, this universe is awful, but those who are native to this universe, who were born into this universe, they all have the right to try to find the best possible life they can, and that by wiping this universe out, we're taking that away from from them. We're dooming countless billions or trillions of people. And so in that moment, he tries to attack Mother Righteous. Now, when that happens, she strips him of his power. And with him basically being powerless, that's when X-23 jumps in with the intention of attacking Mother Righteous. Now, she is able to hit her momentarily, but of course, using her own power, Mother Righteous is able to overcome X-23. But in that moment, Sean Cassidy, looking to atone for all of his actions over the course of Sins of Sinister, ends up stabbing Mother Righteous as a distraction, and once that distraction comes in, X-23 stabs Mother Righteous through the chest with her tail and kills her on the spot. And so when it's all said and done, basically Laura gets her daughter and then teleports away, right? She gets her child and just takes off, and that's basically it. Banshee's just kind of left there dying, and to kind of atone for his actions, the Reliquary Perilous is just sitting there on the ground, and ultimately what ends up happening is the true Moira MacTaggert arrives and seizes it for herself. All indications being she's gonna do exactly what Mother Righteous did, which is find a way to send the heart back to herself, kill herself, reset the timeline, and then attain absolute power. Because lest we forget, one of the things we learn in Jonathan Hickman's run on the X-Men in Inferno is that in order to save the mutant population, the goal of Moira MacTaggert was to eliminate all the mutant powers and the mutant gene itself while preserving the lives of anybody who was a mutant, in effect, making every mutant human. Whether that works or not, we don't fully know. What's going on, guys? This is Rob. We are back with Sins of Sinister, the conclusion. So let's get into it, because I'm excited to see how you feel about the ending, because every comic book fan everywhere is theorizing what the ending means, which I'm really excited to see what you guys think. But what this does, this initially picks up with Storm and the Brotherhood of Mutants with the third issue. Now remember, the third issue of Storm and the Brotherhood picks up 900 years after the death of Storm, when she had that momentary moment where she just went like beyond Omega level and then died. And so what this means is that John Ironfire, kind of the second in command of Storm, is now the one running the show. Now remember, his main power is that he can turn his blood into metal, which will really become important later on down the line. But the other part of this is that this has all drawn the attention of Emma Frost. Now, 1,000 years in the future, Emma Frost has seemingly merged herself with what she calls the Red Diamond, but more or less seems to be a portion of the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak. Now, there's nothing to indicate that she is a Harbinger, which is to say, a version of the Juggernaut, but the fact remains, she is nigh indestructible in this form. And so what she's been doing, or what she is doing at the moment, is scouring the spaceways looking for Sinister, because previously she thought he was dead, but when she found out he was alive, she realized it's only a matter of time before he gets his hands on one of the Moiras, downloads everything that had happened, or takes all the information of the last 1,000 years, puts it into a Moira, and then kills her. Because remember, the nature of Moira MacTaggert's power is that every time she dies, the timeline resets, but she remembers everything that happened over the course of her life. So that's kind of the goal that Sinister has. It's a giant experiment, right? It's literally all it is. Now, what we end up doing here is we pick up with Sinister directly, basically at the headquarters of the Brotherhood, because remember, where the Brotherhood is located, they guard all the clones of Moira. So that's been where Sinister's been trying to get to the entire time. Now, the other thing about this is that if you guys recall, in the early days of the X-Men comics, one of the things we learned is we had what were called the Five. Basically, whenever the X-Men want to resurrect somebody from the dead, they need 5 particular mutants in order to do it. What we end up finding out here is that the mutants that resurrect the dead are basically different now, 1,000 years in the future, than they were in the past, but the process still remains. They can resurrect people. All they needed was the ability to pull it off, kind of a resurrection egg of sorts. And Sinister presents the Brotherhood with that, and they do exactly what you would expect them to do, which is resurrect Storm. But there's a caveat to this, right? It's one of the coolest things about it is a caveat, because when I saw this, my thought was, okay, so like Storm coming back, I kind of get where they're coming from, right? Death doesn't mean the same anymore. Storm does return, but remember, the second part of the resurrection process when it came to the X-Men is they would always back up the memories of the various mutants who died. So when they were resurrected, Jean Grey or Hope Summers or whoever they were using would telepathically put those memories in their head. There's no one here to do that. So yes, Storm is back, but Storm does not remember the full totality of her powers. She doesn't remember how she died. She doesn't remember anything about her past life. So she's basically brand new to the world. Now, it's kind of a funny thing here, because as this happens, Emma Frost makes her move and sends all of her forces directly to the citadel of the Brotherhood. And again, Chimera is the name of the game, merging different mutant powers into a singular mutant. And that's why you have like super strong versions of Cyclops that are gigantic in size, that can fire massive energy beams, and they're just ridiculously strong, all that kinds of stuff. And so the reality here is the forces of Emma are next level, because not only that, Emma Frost actually allows herself to be placed inside of what is, in effect, a giant diamond robot, right? Like, she's colossal in size. So then she launches her attack. And because of her telepathy combined with her indestructible form, she basically just starts crushing everybody at the Citadel. Now, it's a really cool moment when this happens. And the reason why is because John Ironfire leads the attack against Emma Frost's forces, but then at that moment, because a Doombot had survived, right? We covered that in the last video that we did, that Sinister rips off the hands of one of the Doombots, which, as you guys know, basically have like these little lasers that can shoot out of them. By all standards of measurement, he effectively has a gun. And so when this happens, Storm basically uses her powers, or uses the kind of intuition that comes with what you could call the knowledge of her powers, taps into what she's capable of, and then launches an attack against Emma Frost. Now, for the most part, she's relatively successful. This is also because of the fact that Cora, who has the ability to amplify the powers of other people, boosts the powers of Storm. We saw that in the second issue of Storm and the Brotherhood, which is how Storm became Beyond Omega level in the first place. The same thing happens here, but the difference is that instead of Storm using magic like she did in the second issue, what she does is it shows a pure display of what she's capable of. Now, this is a huge moment, right? It's very easy to forget, and it's very easy to lose focus of how significant this is. But what Storm does is she uses her power over the lightning to control the electrons within the structure of Emma Frost, this giant robotic body, and then detonates the whole thing in what's basically a nuclear explosion. Now, it does kill Storm, but the big moment behind this, and the reason why this is so important, is because it shows that Storm can control the electrons of any object around her due to her ability to tap into lightning. Now, this is comparable to like Jubilee from the X-Men. For those of you guys who don't know what I'm talking about, there's a comic where Emma Frost, if I remember correctly, it was Emma Frost, had seized control of Jubilee and then realized when she makes those little firework type things that she's actually detonating matter, and that if Jubilee's power were pushed to its absolute limits, she could quite literally detonate matter on the subatomic level and just create nuclear explosions out of nowhere. She could blow up a whole world if she wanted to, or even make a star go supernova. We haven't really seen anything to indicate that she's getting to that point, but that's the potential of what she has. Storm is very much in that way. This is an instance where Marvel is teasing what Storm's capable of, and we may very well see that at some future point in time. But of course, Storm basically perishes, so she was here just kind of for a moment, long enough to defeat Emma Frost. But in this momentary distraction, Sinister uses the gun from the Doctor Doom Doombot and then fires it at John Ironfire and shoots him in the head. And so with John Ironfire out of the picture, seemingly the entire landscape is clear, right? Emma Frost is defeated, her forces will launch a counterattack, but the reality is they're not overly concerned about it. What Sinister is concerned about is that with Emma Frost defeated, someone's going to step up and take her place. And when they do, they're going to come after the Moira McTaggart clones as well. So in reality, they're really on a kind of timeline here. The other thing that complicates this is access to where the clones are located is blocked, and there's seemingly no way to get to it. Now, one of the funny things about this is Sinister talks about in the message that was left to him by Destiny that there was a kind of indication that Destiny had set in motion a set of events that would allow Sinister to gain access to the clones by quite literally destroying the door. This coincides with the moment that we covered in the last video when we ended up finding out that in the early days when Sinister was basically taking over everything, when the X-Men were coming under Sinister's control, that they fired Juggernaut into space, literally out of a cannon, in order to destroy Thanos. Because remember, once the Juggernaut starts moving, nothing can stop him. And being fired at Thanos like a gun would blow a hole right through him. And that's exactly what it did, right? It killed Thanos on the spot. But what this also did is it just sent Juggernaut careening through space, speeding up, going faster and faster, right? Just slingshotting off of stars and different things like that. This is what we talked about in the last video. It's Destiny playing the long game. As a precognitive, she can see the future. And so even though a 1,000-year prediction isn't the most solid prediction when it comes to Destiny, every so often, it is exactly right? Literally, the Juggernaut comes flying through, punches Galactus in the head, who had shown up here being possessed by all the powers of the Ghost Rider. Again, we covered that in the last video. Make sure you guys check the comments. You'll find a link to the Sins of Sinister playlist so you can get caught up on everything. And then in turn, like, punches a hole directly through the door where the Moiras are being located. That gives them the entrance. Now, the other version, the girl that you see here in like the white outfit with the blonde hair, that is a Moira McTaggart, but it's a robot, right? It's not an actual Moira, so she doesn't have an X gene, right? So if you were to kill her, nothing would happen here. But the thing about this is that we end up finding out that John Ironfire actually survived. And the reason why, what he did here, and it's probably the most comic book logic thing ever, right? The biggest MacGuffin ever, because he has the ability to turn his blood into metal, that before going into a battle, which is a pretty smart thing, he does exactly that. He just like protected his inner workings. So you basically have like flesh and bone, veins, all that kind of stuff. And then now his blood is basically metal. It was a layer of protection against the shot that Sinister fired. So that's how John Ironfire lived here. And so a kind of fight breaks out between the two of them, but it's basically just buying time for Moira McTaggart to get in there. The problem is that while Moira McTaggart is supposed to gain access to all the other Moira clones, she's supposed to clear the way if there's any resistance for Sinister. The problem with this is that her immediate response is, I need to destroy these clones. But Sinister wants to take the information he has, download it into the clones so that when one of them dies, the timeline resets, and all the way back at the very beginning at year 0, before everything happens, Sinister can extract the information and then basically know where he went wrong. So when he repeats his experiment trying to take over the entirety of the universe, he knows where he misstepped and he can correct those mistakes. The problem with this is that in the absence of Emma Frost, Hank McCoy, Beast, who has basically assumed control of her forces, contacts Charles Xavier. But Xavier, also being in control here, right, being just a villain at this point in time, starts to realize it's a chance for opportunity. So he seizes control of Hank McCoy, seizes control of everybody in just like this immediate area, and then quite literally makes a planet unto himself. Professor Xavier of the X-Men becomes a whole world, and then he just starts traveling directly to the Citadel where Moira McTaggart and all those different clones are being held. Now, once you have John and them who realize what's going on, John Ironfire has this genius idea, right? He literally conjures this energy dagger and then slices his forehead, right? And what he does is as the blood comes out, he controls it and turns it into a helmet of Magneto, which basically blocks the telepathic abilities of Charles Xavier. It's one of the smartest moves that I've seen from his character. Like, I mean, it's not to say he's dumb, but it's a genius idea. And so what ends up happening here is that Sinister kind of pleads with John Ironfire and saying, look, I get that you guys, as part of the Brotherhood and all that kind of stuff, you're soldiers, warriors, and having an honorable death is the way you want to go, and so on and so forth, but you don't really want to die here. More so than that, you do not want Xavier to kill all of us, kill one of the Moiras, reset the timeline, and then he's in control, right? So we have to find a way to defeat Xavier, and only you can do it. But you need more power. And because blood is literally the source of your power, I can inject you with a sample of Iceman, which will basically allow you to amplify your abilities by producing more water vapor. Blood is 70% water, so you can basically create more blood. Is it comic book logic? Absolutely. Like, I mean, there's nothing about this that's logical or reasonable. Like, it's just a thing that's being done for the purpose of telling the story. But it's amazing because literally this guy just like uses this injection, conjures on like just this insane kind of like structure, right? This metal form. He looks like a devil version of Magneto. He looks like a beast. And then he just charges at Xavier, right? Like the whole planet of Xavier. And he's able to kind of punch a hole through him to a degree, but in reality, it's just a giant fight between the two. So while John Ironfire and Xavier are fighting, that Sinister takes off to the clone lab and then tries to find a way to stop this robot version of Moira McTaggart. But the reality here is he kind of strikes a deal with her and says, look, this is like, if I don't do this, right? Like if I do not take this information on what I've learned and download it into one of the Moiras, then what'll happen is history will repeat itself. I'll make the same mistakes, the same screw ups, and this will just be a giant 1,000-year time loop over and over and over again. If I download this information, it'll be a way to break the cycle. And I will literally tell myself, do not pursue this godhood. Do not do that. And so ultimately, this robot version of Moira lets him get away with it. And so in turn, he basically goes in and tries to destroy one of these Moira McTaggarts. But in the process of it, as he's downloading this information, he starts to come to this revelation information, maybe he can be God, right? Maybe he can be just like some astronomically powerful person. But in shutting down, like in destroying one of these Moiras, it basically wipes out the galaxy and everybody in it, right? It wipes out the whole universe. It doesn't really blink the timeline out of existence. And here's the reason why. Because of the fact that the timeline doesn't go away, this is basically Marvel telling us this is now an alternate reality. The fact that this has happened means it always will happen, right? Like this is always going to take place. Sinister can try to change it, and maybe he will. But the fact that all of this has happened before, and the fact that he's even sending information back into the past to prevent it from taking place, it means this universe has to happen. Now, the funny thing about this is that in this moment, Sinister himself seems to kind of transcend, and he actually takes off and tries to form a kind of dominion, right? Literally, basically seize control of time and space. But what he finds out when he gets there, when he kind of transcends, is that somebody beat him to the punch, that seemingly a Sinister dominion has already been created. One of the other Sinisters transcended time and space. They exist beyond everything. And so even if there is an attempt by Sinister to kill one of the Moiras and reset the timeline, that there is seemingly a Sinister out there that has already seized control of everything. And everything that's happening in the universe is now happening because of their whim. That's the implication. There's nothing to say that that's the case. It's Sinister's hypothesis, is what he believed happened, but at the end of the day, we don't necessarily know for sure. And so here's the kicker to this, right? Like when Sinister comes back, he realizes somebody did beat him to the punch. There's seemingly no way to fix everything. John Ironfire reappears after having presumably killed Xavier, pissed off at the fact that Sinister basically wiped out the entirety of all life across the universe. John Ironfire kills Sinister on the spot, and then we jump back. Right, like literally we jump back to year zero, right? Now, exactly how this jump back to year zero happens, not entirely sure. It could just be a cascading effect. It could be that like the destruction of all life across the universe is kind of the first stage in what is in effect the reset of the timeline. The reason I say that is that in previous instances in the X-Men comics and Marvel, we never really saw how the process takes place. Emma Frost dies, and then you just jump back to the very beginning of everything, right? We don't actually see how that process unfolds. So this may just be part of the whole thing. But of course, jumping back to year zero, right? The moment in which Sinister decides to make the decision to start putting his own gene into the various X-Men as they're being resurrected in order to seize control. That as he's scanning one of the Miras, he finds 1,000 years worth of information stored inside of her. And so when he downloads the information, everything blows up, right? Everything just goes nuts all of a sudden. And you basically have the real Moira McTaggart who shows up here and kind of spills the beans. And that she had seemingly died alongside everything else. And so what this kind of implies here, this is one of the theories that's circulating out there, what this seems to imply is that the white-suited Moira McTaggart was not actually a robot. It was the real Moira McTaggart the entire time. Because remember, she's immortal. You can kill her through any conventional means, but she'll never die of natural causes. She'll stay youthful forever. So that seems to be who this actually was. So when she, in effect, actually reset the timeline, that gets us to where we are right now. But the kicker about all this is Moira McTaggart basically tells Sinister everything that was going on. That when you had Mother Righteous, right, an alternate version of Sinister or kind of a different version of Sinister in the future, who was trying to find a way to download information and then reset the timeline so she could be in control, all that stuff, that everything popped off there. But the reality of what she says here is that she watched as Sinister had basically tried to achieve godhood, and then in turn came to a profound realization that somebody had beat him to the punch. And the information that was sent back to the past was exclusively that. There's no grand amount of information that shows the mistakes he made, how he could have created things differently, where he could have fixed everything. That's not the case, right? It's just the information that ultimately somebody beat him there. He never gets to attain godhood the way that he hoped he had. And so what Moira McTaggart does is she wipes out all the clones of herself. Now, the X gene was neutralized, so basically the clones are destroyed, but there's no X gene to reset the timeline, so it's just like killing mannequins, effectively. And so with all that being done, suddenly Rasputin 4 appears out of nowhere, right? Now, Rasputin 4 was basically a creation of Sinister in the Sins of Sinister future, right? Like in that timeline. And so she was initially his ally, but then once she realized he wanted to wipe out the whole universe and kind of reset everything, she turned against him. Her arriving here is basically an instance of a character from an alternate reality appearing in the main Marvel universe. I told you this would probably happen. they would probably end up bringing people from alternate realities or from the Sins of Sinister timeline into the main Marvel universe. And it's cool for what it is, right? But what this also shows here is that Mother Righteous, this alternate clone of Sinister, is still alive and well, right? I mean, she hasn't become the Mother Righteous who's villainous and Sins of Sinister and all that kind of stuff. She's still alive and doing her thing, right? All those different clones of Sinister are still there. The theory that's circulating around out here is that the version of Sinister that achieved godhood, right, dominionhood, is actually Mother Righteous, because there's like this whole wing of a library that just kind of appears out of nowhere, right? Like basically altering reality exclusively for Mother Righteous. And in fact, all the books basically seem to be dedicated to her. It's like this future version of her who would achieve godhood kind of reaching out and saying, I'm doing this for you, right? This is who you become one day. Again, that's just a theory that's circulating around. We don't definitively know. But what we do know is that following her capture of Sinister, Rasputin basically shows up here and effectively meets Kitty Pryde and the other members of the Quiet Council. Now, what ends up happening is that she kind of spills the beans to what's going on, but also presents Mother Righteous as the person that was quote unquote the savior, right? The one that basically saved everybody, saved the future of the whole 9 yards. Now, Mother Righteous is manipulative. Exactly how this transpires, we don't know, right? Because as far as we're aware, Mother Righteous, as she exists now in the X-Men comics, has no knowledge of what will happen over the course of the next 1,000 years when you have the whole Sins of Sinister timeline unfolding. We don't know, right? All we really know is that she's just kind of here, and she is a clone of like the original Sinister, and she's been operating for the last few hundred years, and that's it. That's all we know about her character. But she basically puts herself forward as a person who is kind of the savior of existence. But one of the things that happens is that when Rasputin 4 spills the beans on what's going to happen over the course of the next 1,000 years as a result of Sinister basically putting his genes inside all the different X-Men that are being cloned, is that the X-Men come to the realization Sinister is the greatest threat among them. Now, the funny thing here is that because Sinister, as he stands now, was given information about, from his future self about how some version of him out there achieved godhood, he tries to tell the X-Men there is a Sinister out there manipulating everything. There's a Sinister out there controlling everything, manipulating everything. It's not me. You have to believe me. But because of his villainous past, as well as what he's supposed to be doing over the course of the next 1,000 years in Sins of Sinister, none of the X-Men believe it. None of them believe anything he's saying, so they ultimately confine him to the pit. The other caveat to this is that in order to ensure that Sinister has not already started his scheme, they have to quote-unquote purify the X-Men gene, which means scan them and make sure nobody is influenced by Sinister's genes. But because Emma Frost and Xavier and these guys are leaders of the Quiet Council, and because they're so powerful and in that future, they're the ones who go nuts and basically conquer the entirety of the universe, that what they do is they voluntarily confine themselves to the pit. Now, this kind of seems to be manipulation at the hands of Mother Righteous to a degree. And that's the other part of this theory, that Mother Righteous is the one who does achieve godhood, because she's the only one who shows up here, and she's the only one who says, in order to ensure that Sinister's influence is no longer here in the rest of the X-Men, we have to confine the Quiet Council. You guys know it's what's best for the mutant community. She's clearing the landscape of any threats. She's clearing the landscape of the most powerful telepaths. She's clearing the landscape of Hope Summers, who's instrumental in being able to revive any X-Men who die, which means now that an X-Men is dead, they stay dead, right? There's no way to bring them back, right? She's removing any threats to her potential attempt to seize power of not just Krakoa itself, but even the world as a whole, because she is a straight up villain. That's kind of where everybody is leaning to here. So again, because of this realization, the X-Men are confined to the pit, and seemingly the stage is set for Mother Righteous to seize control as the newest version of Sinister, and ultimately basically repeat the process of Sins of Sinister and effectively come out on top. But with that being said, guys, let me know what you guys think about this down in the comments section. It's a really wonky final issue. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.